Hello fellow Sapiens, and a quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're spiralling softly towards sleep, filling the stillness of a midnight drive, or simply looking for something slower and deeper than the noise, you're in the right place. Because tonight we journey into the shadow of an almost ending, the Ice Age that nearly erased us. This is cinematic history and contemplative science, told with reverence for the fragile thread that binds us to our beginnings. This is the untold story of our species, one shaped by 30,000 years of cold, by the slow silence of glaciers, and by the improbable fire that refused to go out. But it begins not with collapse, but with a question. How do you survive a world trying to forget you? Oh, and if you're the kind of strange and thoughtful human who enjoys long-form science, philosophical calm, and the forensic echoes of deep time, just look below this video. There's a little button that says subscribe. You can press it if you'd like, and unsubscribe any time. There's a bell icon next to it too. Tapping that will let you know when the next story arrives. Subscribing helps this channel survive. Without it, these videos simply can't be made. By the way, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing, drop it in the comments. It's a gentle reminder that we are all listening together. Also, if you fall asleep, that's completely fine. Timestamps are in the description if you return. Now, we begin with the snow that swallowed the world. The Ice Age that nearly erased humanity was not a moment. It was a silence so vast it swallowed centuries, a stillness so deep even memory struggled to survive it. Earth, once a canvas of movement and sound, had been pressed under a planetary hush, a frozen breath held too long. What happens to a species, not when it vanishes, but when it almost does? What lingers in the bones of those who remain? Knowing how close the end had come, at its height, the world was sealed beneath ice. 26,000 years ago, glaciers flowed like petrified rivers from pole to mid-latitude, dragging stone across stone in a slow, grinding exhale, the Last Glacial Maximum. It was a name given by scientists, but it might as well have been a verdict. Temperatures plummeted, rain retreated, and the oceans shrank as water was drawn into the cold sky and locked away in frozen cathedrals miles deep. The seafloor itself was exposed, an entire anatomy of the planet unveiled beneath the breathless weight of water turned to ice. In Eurasia, the great mammoth steppe sprawled from the British Isles to Siberia, but it was not the paradise of grasslands it might sound like. It was wind-bitten, desolate, an empire of frost where nothing softened and nothing sang. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet had swallowed much of the continent. In Europe, ice covered Scandinavia, northern Germany, and the British Isles, reaching down like pale fingers scraping the earth. Even the tropics shriveled, deserts expanded, forests died, mountains became graves of clouds. It was a planet veiled in white, but it was not purity, it was starvation. And somewhere, within the ice-locked world, was us. Not the us of now, not the billions, not the cities that glow at night or the voices that travel wirelessly across oceans. We were few, staggeringly few. Perhaps no more than 10,000 breeding individuals, a number smaller than the population of a modern village, scattered across continents, isolated by distance, hunted by cold and hunger and time itself, a whisper against the wind. How does a species carry itself forward from such a razor's edge? The contraction of habitable zones was merciless. Entire ecosystems collapsed beneath the glacial advance, and with them, the networks of life that sustained early humans. Food became scarce, migration became impossible. To step too far in any direction was to walk into death. Refuge became a word that no longer meant safety, only the absence of extinction for one more day. We gathered where we could, in caves along southern coasts, in valleys sheltered by mountains, along thin rivers that had not yet frozen into stillness. We stayed where the cold could not quite finish what it had started. But even there we did not thrive. We endured. And in that endurance, something else took root. Not triumph, not yet, but something older and quieter. The will to remember. The will to remain. We endured. And in that endurance, something else took root. Not triumph, not yet, but something older and quieter, the will to remember, the will to remain. What does it mean for memory to survive when the world forgets everything else? To understand what remained, we must understand what was taken across vast stretches of what is now Europe and Asia. Entire biomes withered beneath the cold. Animals migrated or perished, plants retreated, and the sounds of life were muffled beneath snow and silence. For early humans, the map of survival redrew itself constantly, erasing old paths and closing familiar doors. Where once there had been abundance, there was now scarcity. Where once there had been kin, there was now distance. The world had become a puzzle made of fewer and fewer pieces, but survival was never just about warmth or meat or shelter. It was about the spaces between those things, the subtle alliances formed with other families, other bands. The knowledge passed from mouth to ear, generation to generation. When a people fragment across an ice-sealed world, what fragments with them? What rituals do they keep? What names do they whisper? What songs do they bury with their dead? These were not people who built monuments, not yet, but they left their breath on the walls of caves, stenciled in ochre and ash. They scratched the rhythms of seasons into bone. They scattered tools like breadcrumbs across riverbanks and ridges, the detritus of persistence, a flake of obsidian here, a carved antler there, each one a voice, soft but insistent. We were here. We stayed. We remembered how to make fire, and even that fire was no longer simple. In this colder world, fuel itself was precious. Wood did not grow freely, and what little could be found had to be carried, preserved, cherished. Fires were not sparks of luxury. They were the slow, smouldering hearts of camps, light to see by, heat to survive, and a centre to speak around. Perhaps even the first stories were told as frost gathered on the cave mouth, and wolves howled in the distance, and children clung to warmth and myth alike. Where did they go, these scattered bands? Some found shelter along the southern coast of Africa, where the ocean still offered its gifts: shellfish, kelp, warmth from the current. Others clung to the edges of the Persian Gulf, then a dry basin not yet flooded. In the Levant, in pockets of modern-day Israel and Jordan, the stone tools do not disappear. They evolve. That continuity matters. It is a thread, frayed but unbroken, running through the frozen dark. And yet, no part of this story offers certainty. Much of what we know in whispers, through mitochondrial DNA, through the shape of a skull, through carbon trapped in soil. This is not a history with chapters. It is a history written in echoes, and that is what makes it so fragile and so astonishing. Not because we know everything, but because we know anything at all. How did these ancient sapiens hold on to meaning when the world gave them nothing to build upon but ash and snow? Perhaps meaning like fire does not need abundance to burn. Perhaps it thrives in scarcity. Beneath the immense silence of the glacial sky, humans still carved, still painted, still whispered names into the dark. They were surrounded by extinction, but they did not go quietly into it. Instead, they sang to the bones. They made tools that fit the curve of the hand like remembered prayers. They passed knowledge in murmurs, from grandmother to child, from hunter to firekeeper, from the dying to the newborn. There was no permanence, only motion, but within that motion, there was care. In places like Blombus Cave in southern Africa, ochre was etched with cross-hatched patterns, careful and abstract. Not utilitarian, not accidental. Symbols, which means thoughts about thoughts, which means a mind reflecting upon itself, even as the world narrowed. Is this not, in some sense, the definition of resilience? And yet it was not only minds that were shaped. Bodies too bore the marks of survival. Early humans in glacial Europe grew stockier, with shorter limbs, compact forms that lost heat more slowly. We adapted, subtly, across generations. Skin tones darkened or lightened to balance sunlight and vitamin synthesis. The landscape rewrote us. Not all at once, not everywhere, but gradually, like frost reshaping a branch. Meanwhile, language, that ghost we cannot fossilize, may have become more essential than ever. In smaller, more isolated bands, the cost of miscommunication was no longer just confusion. It was death. Who knew how to track an animal across icy stone? Who remembered the plant that soothed a wound? Who had seen the sky shift and knew what it meant? If even one such voice was lost, the entire band might perish. In that sense, culture became a form of inheritance as critical as blood. And what of emotion? What does empathy become when stretched across a frozen continent? Archaeological finds show care for the injured, burials of the dead, adornments placed with the remains. Even when survival was not guaranteed, we gave our dead more than disposal. We gave them ceremony. Why? Perhaps because it tethered the living to something bigger than the present. To mourn is to resist oblivion. And so, even as the ice-crushed forests and silence consumed the open steppe, these early humans did not vanish. They grew quiet. They grew careful. They adapted not just with tools and bodies, but with stories, with ritual, with firelight flickering against limestone. They became shadows in the corners of the world, small, flickering, and astonishingly durable. Can a story be kept alive not with writing, but with walking, with remembering, with breathing? Even when the world forgets your name, it seems that it can, because we are here, and in our bones, in our blood, in the layered strata of our minds, there are still echoes of that wintered world. The genes we carry trace back to those few who remained. To the ones who held fire not as a luxury but as a final line between breath and stillness. To the ones who knew how to wait, how to read the stars when they were dimmed by frost, how to follow the sound of flowing water buried under snow. Their legacy is not a monument, it is continuity. At the heart of this Ice Age crucible lay something more delicate than bone, the social thread. In times of plenty, groups could afford to fragment, to squabble, to forget. But when the cold pressed in, when survival balanced on a blade of shared knowledge, cooperation became oxygen. Bands had to trust, had to share food, warmth, and warning, had to know not just how to make a spear, but who had the strength to throw it, who had the skill to bind its stone to wood, who had the wisdom to aim it only when needed. These were not utopias. The Ice Age did not offer comfort or fairness, but within those difficult conditions something human crystallized. Not just anatomy, not just fire, but connection, the fragile architecture of shared lives moving through hardship together, the flicker of empathy in the teeth of extinction, and yet while some found ways to remain, others did not. Across Eurasia, the Neanderthals, who had survived colder climates for longer, began to disappear. Their tools vanish from the record, their hearths go cold. They were not less intelligent, they were not weaker, but they were fewer, and perhaps, in a world that demanded flexibility and alliance, they were less connected. It is a thought that troubles, a mirror we do not always wish to look into, because the lesson of this near erasure is not about supremacy, it is about precarity. There was no divine guarantee that Homo sapiens would endure. For every path we took that led to survival, there were countless others that could have ended in silence. We were not chosen, we were spared, by chance, by adaptation, by the thin persistence of culture. And in that persistence, a pattern emerged. The contraction of ice did not freeze imagination, it clarified it. Songs became simpler, but heavier with meaning. Tools became more specialized. Networks of trade, however primitive, reached across astonishing distances. Shells from the Red Sea appear inland. Ochre from distant mines stain sites hundreds of miles away. Even in fragmentation, the threads reached outward. What does it mean that in the bleakest cold, humanity reached not inward, but toward one another? It means that survival was never just a matter of anatomy or tool use or climate resistance. It was a matter of story, of memory carried in the warmth of breath and passed through generations like fire cupped in shaking hands. In those dark corridors of time, where the earth slept beneath its icebound mask, the earliest chapters of what it meant to be human were carved, not in stone, but in endurance. And that endurance was not solitary, it was collective. This was the crucible of becoming. Not a grand ascent, not a march of progress, but a narrowing, a near loss. We speak often of evolution as if it favours the strong, the clever, the ruthless. But in this frozen age, it may have favoured the adaptable, the empathetic, the ones who gathered close and whispered warmth into one another's ears. Those who sang lullabies beside flickering embers, who buried their dead with care, who shared the last dried meat in the hope of tomorrow. As the last glacial maximum reached its zenith, nearly 70% of the planet's fresh water was trapped in ice. The ocean stood over 400 feet lower than today. Whole coastlines vanished, buried under continental glaciers. Forests turned to steppe, lakes became dust, and through it all tiny clusters of Homo sapiens remained. in South African caves washed with sea mist, in Levantine valleys flanked by thawed stone, in sunlit cracks along the southern spine of Eurasia. They were scattered, fragile, exposed, but they were not extinguished. It is easy, from the vantage of the present, to see ourselves as inevitable, but the Ice Age reminds us we are not inevitable, we are a consequence. A thread that could have snapped at any moment but didn't, and for tens of thousands of years that thread was stretched across a world that did not want us. A world where wind howled across the bones of extinct herds, where time moved in slow glacial inches, where every step forward was a choice made again and again, not by kings or inventors, but by unnamed people with frostbitten hands and stories no one recorded. So when we speak of the Ice Age that nearly erased us, we must not speak only of cold or scarcity. We must speak of silence, of the silence that blanketed continents and seeped into bones, of the silence that came before language fully flowered, and most of all of the silence we defied, not with noise but with presence, with memory, with the fragile and astonishing decision to stay alive, because that is what we did. We stayed. We made no promise of triumph, we built no tower, but we stayed, and beneath all the ice, all the silence, all the weight of a world too cold to care, we waited. What kind of species survives not by conquering the world, but by listening long enough to hear it breathe again? We were fewer than the stars remember. Not a myth, not a metaphor, a measurable fact, carried not in scrolls or ruins, but in the helix of our blood. Somewhere between 70 and 50,000 years ago, the human population plummeted to numbers so low we could have vanished without a trace. Not all at once, not in fire or flood, but slowly, like breath fading in frost. What remains of that time is not a clear record, but a ghost in our genomes, a whisper of how close we came to silence. When scientists speak of a genetic bottleneck, they are speaking of collapse, a sudden and severe reduction in the genetic diversity of a species. In Homo sapiens, that reduction was sharp enough to be seen today in the remarkable similarity of our DNA. For a species spread across continents, our genetic variance is astonishingly narrow. In fact, two chimpanzees from the same forest may differ more than any two humans born oceans apart. What could have caused such a narrowing? Climate, famine, catastrophe, isolation, each a blade, but together a storm. During the Toba supereruption, roughly 74,000 years ago, a volcanic winter may have darkened the sky, cooled the earth, and triggered a global ecological shock. Ash drifted across South Asia. Temperatures dropped, rain patterns shifted, and the fragile ecosystem sustaining early humans collapsed. Whether Toba alone was the cause remains debated, but the fingerprint of devastation is real. Populations fragmented, resources dwindled, extinction loomed. Yet even before and after Toba, the world was hardly forgiving. The glacial seesaw of the Pleistocene offered only brief reprieves between long, punishing freezes. Hunting bands were forced to adapt or die. Migrations failed. Croplands did not yet exist, and across great swathes of Africa and Eurasia, humans simply disappeared. So few remained. Some estimates suggest no more than a few thousand breeding individuals survived this contraction, a number so small it sits uneasily next to our current billions. Imagine it, the entirety of human continuity resting in the hands of a single village, a single extended family. Perhaps a few caves, perhaps fewer, and yet we endure. Not as clones, but as a tightly bound lineage. Modern genetics traces many of our maternal lines back to a single woman. Not the first woman, nor the only one, but the one whose daughter's daughters survived while others did not. She is called, poetically, mitochondrial Eve. Not a queen, not a prophet, just a woman who lived, perhaps in East Africa, perhaps near the coast, perhaps never knowing she held within her the thread of our future. How many other lines were lost? How many languages silenced, never written, never passed down? How many stories buried in the ash and snow? What must it have felt like to stand in that thinning world, unsure whether your kind would endure the season, let alone the epoch? Perhaps there was no understanding at all, only instinct. The instinct to find warmth, to feed children, to remember paths carved into the dust by ancestors whose names had already dissolved into wind. But within that instinct, something else stirred. The unspoken knowledge that survival itself had become an act of meaning, that to live, even briefly, was to resist oblivion. Every fire lit in the dark was a message. We are still here. When scientists examine mitochondrial DNA today, they see those messages encoded in the double helix. They see the aftermath of that contraction written into our cells, a record of near annihilation. The lineages that vanished left no markers, no descendants. Only those few whose mitochondrial lines persisted remain as threads woven into the human fabric. The pattern is unmistakable. A species bottlenecked through crisis, reborn from the smallest of foundations. It is tempting to imagine this Eve as singular, but she was not alone. She was part of a web of survivors, all of whom carried potential futures within them. She was not chosen. She simply endured. She hunted, perhaps, or gathered, or raised her children beneath the shifting skies of a harsher earth. She may have lived her life unaware that millennia later, her mitochondria would become the shared inheritance of an entire species. Her survival was not destiny, it was persistence. The numbers that emerge from genetic modelling are almost impossible to grasp. Between 2,000 and 10,000 individuals may have carried the weight of humanity through this period of contraction. That is fewer than the number of people who can fit inside a modern stadium, fewer than the population of a small town. Imagine walking through such a world, vast landscapes empty of smoke, of song, of human trace. Imagine the silence, not as peace, but as absence. Isolation compounded this fragility. Each group, separated by mountains, deserts, or glaciers, became a universe unto itself. Genetic drift magnified the effect. With so few individuals interbreeding within isolated clusters, mutations and traits were amplified or lost. Diversity thinned. Our collective potential, the sum of all possible variations, was compressed into a narrow range. The consequences of that compression still shape us. We are in a sense the children of a narrow gate. And yet, perhaps that narrowness was also refinement, a forging, a moment where chance sculpted resilience, when the bonds of kinship became not optional, but essential, when memory and cooperation replaced strength as the instruments of survival, when the human story was pared down to its core, vulnerability intertwined with will. How much of what we call humanity today was born in that crucible of reduction, not from plenty, but from the near loss of everything? A species under siege becomes a species that listens. When nature turns hostile, when the land no longer gives freely, when neighbours are few and far between, every detail begins to matter. The wind is not just air, but signal. The cloud is not just sky, but warning. A child's cough is not just discomfort, but a threat to continuity. And in that listening, something ancient and precious awakens, the art of noticing. Perhaps that is where culture truly deepened, not in the abundance of Eden, but in the scarcity of aftermath. With so few of us alive, every fragment of knowledge had to be guarded, remembered, retold. You did not forget which plant soothed fever. You did not forget which constellation marked the season's turn. And you did not forget the names of the dead, because their memory was the only monument you could carry. Famine makes an archivist of the mind, and famine was everywhere. The ice did not only bring cold, it restructured the food web. Animals migrated to unknown ranges, edible plants receded, rain patterns fractured into unpredictability. With ecosystems in flux, our ancestors had to relearn the world again and again. To fail was to die, but to remember, that was to buy another day. These pressures honed more than memory. They shaped how we looked, how we moved, how we passed information. In a world where survival depended on knowing who remembered the salmon's path or the route that numbed pain, social cohesion became as important as shelter. Gossip became infrastructure. Trust became currency. Those who cooperated, who taught, who shared, they endured. Those who hoarded, who wandered alone, they vanished. And so language flourished not as luxury, but as lifeline. It may have begun earlier, in the deep times of pre-Ice Age hominins, but here, under pressure, it became indispensable. With language came not just information, but nuance, emotion, warning, imagination. The ability to describe a landscape never seen. The ability to say, I remember what my grandmother saw and it will return. That capacity to carry the past forward and cast it into the future is what distinguishes us. Even now, the trace of that long silence lingers, in our shared vocabulary of loss, in the way myths begin with floods, with darkness, with a time before. We are a species haunted not just by death, but by near death. Our earlier stories may not have been about gods or origins, but about hunger, about the last mammoth, about the winter that nearly didn't end. Is that why we build cities that shine so brightly? To push back at the memory of those nights when the only fire was the one you could hold in your hand, and even that might go out before morning? Because deep in the marrow of us, there remains a whisper of that fragile time, a quiet reminder that we are not ancient in our safety, that civilization is a recent song, and the silence that came before it is still echoing. Every population curve, every demographic map, every strand of DNA tells the same story. Once, long ago, we were almost nothing. The genetic bottleneck is not simply a number. It is a wound, a record of closeness to the void, and from that wound, an unexpected legacy emerged. Across all human populations today, from the high Arctic to the rainforest edge, the variance in our DNA is narrow. We are not a patchwork of wildly different kinds, as might be expected after hundreds of thousands of years of dispersal. We are instead intimately related, siblings separated by geography, not by ancestry. A species bound together not just by culture, but by contraction. This closeness has implications beyond the poetic. It affects our immune systems, our susceptibility to disease, our genetic predispositions. In our unity there is vulnerability. We are not a braided cord of many strands. We are a single thread stretched across time, tightened by the hand of extinction. Had a few more camps failed, a few more mothers died, a few more winters been colder, there might be no one left to ask these questions, and yet we are here. That fact alone invites reverence, not pride, reverence, because we did not earn survival through superiority. We were not the strongest, we were not the fastest, we were simply the ones who held on. Through cold, through hunger, through terror, through absence, we persisted, and persistence, it seems, became our defining trait. This is why our myths begin with struggle, not celebration, not conquest. Struggle. Creation born from chaos. A world rising out of void. A woman holding fire. A man walking alone into the dark and finding others. These are not inventions. They are remembrances. Filtered through time, the Ice Age carved its mark not only on landscape and bone, but on imagination. It sculpted the architectures of fear and hope. Even our dreams remember it. The dream of being lost, of being hunted, of walking endless plains beneath a cold, indifferent sky. These are not just symbols, they are echoes, the inheritance of a species that once stood on the edge of erasure and chose somehow to stay. What would the world look like now if those few survivors had failed to pass on their flame, not just their genes, but their stories, their instincts, their tenderness? Would anything human remain at all? The question lingers, not as tragedy, but as awe, because the answer is us. Every child born today is a continuation of that narrow thread, the same thread that wound its way through volcanic ash, across frost-cracked stone beneath skies emptied of warmth. We are not merely the descendants of survivors. We are survival, made flesh. We carry in us the decisions of those who shared instead of hoarded, who waited instead of fled, who whispered instead of wept. Even now we search the genome for further clues. Deep within our DNA, tiny markers show just how little diversity remains compared to what might have been. They map our maternal lines through mitochondrial DNA, our paternal lines through the Y chromosome. They reveal convergences, overlaps, places where the line almost stopped, and yet always, improbably, it continued. These studies tell us more than statistics. They tell us that survival was not evenly spread. Some regions fared better, some populations collapsed entirely, but the pattern is unmistakable. Again and again, humanity was reduced to near nothing, only to rise, not in triumph, but in continuation. There is a difference. Continuation does not ask for glory. It asks only for the next step, the next fire, the next word spoken to a child in the night, and that is how we returned, not in conquest, but in quiet re-emergence, a slow rethreading of the world, one generation at a time. This bottleneck also explains a paradox. How did Homo sapiens, a species that once numbered in the thousands, come to reshape an entire planet? Perhaps because we learned, in that narrow place of near extinction, that we are not separate from fragility, we are made of it. And in being made of it, we learned how to hold it, in our hands, in our minds, in the stories we now tell about who we were and who we are. It's strange to think, you and I sitting here, listening and wondering, are proof that those ancient choices mattered. Proof that someone tended the fire, someone watched the stars, someone kept walking. They did not know what we would become. They did not even know if we would become anything at all, and yet they did not stop. Their blood moves in us. Their memories shape the architecture of our fears. Their resilience breathes behind our art, our language, our love of the night sky. They are not lost. They are not gone. They are merely quiet now, part of the silence between heartbeats, the hush before sleep, the stillness from which all stories begin. What does it say about us that we come from so little, yet carry so much? What might it mean that a species once nearly erased by wind and cold now dares to ask where it came from, and listens for an answer in the stars? Long before cities rose and before gods had names, there was a moment when the human mind lit a fire no frost could put out. The Ice Age had swallowed the world in silence, yet somewhere, in a cave, in the shadow of beasts, in the breath of frost on stone, a hand reached out not to kill, not to gather, not even to survive, but to create. What kind of hunger drives a creature to sing in the dark? What kind of hope dares to paint a bison on a wall of cold limestone, not for food, not for trade, but for something deeper, something unspeakable, something sacred? The land may have been starved of warmth, but within our ancestors, a new kind of flame began to burn. Not the flame of fire, but the flame of meaning. We call it the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, though revolution is perhaps too loud a word for what arrived like snowfall, slowly, softly, changing everything. Between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, the archaeological record begins to whisper in a new tongue. Carved figurines, ochre-stained beads, bone flutes, cave paintings that still breathe across time. Not just tools, but symbols. Not just function, but metaphor. In the caves of Lascaux and Chauvet, in the limestone cathedrals of Altamira and Sulawesi, the walls themselves bloom with life. Bison charge, horses gallop, hands leave negative impressions, human shadows burned into stone by the breath of ochre blown from the mouth. These are not depictions, they are invocations. To look at them is to witness thought made visible. But what were they thinking? Were these records of the hunt? Were they prayers to animals? Were they memories? Warnings? How do you paint survival? Perhaps the question is not what they painted, but why? Why does a species on the brink of starvation use its precious time to make marks that only others might see? The answer, if it exists, must lie not in the hand, but in the mind. This is the moment, quiet and eternal, when humans stopped simply reacting to the world and began reflecting upon it. The moment when perception deepened into imagination. Language, too, may have matured during this era, gaining complexity, rhythm, recursion. If so, it wasn't just the body that evolved, it was the soul. The ability to tell a story is the ability to bind the past and future together in a single thread of sound. And when survival depends on memory, on how to find the cave, how to track the reindeer, how to soothe a dying child, that thread becomes more than culture. It becomes salvation. So what happens when a species learns not only to survive the Ice Age, but to dream through it? What happens when the cold deepens, but so does the mind? Something astonishing. In the grip of the last glacial cycles, when famine was not a fear but a fact, and death lingered behind every snowfall, our ancestors began to speak not only with mouths, but with symbols. They made meaning where none was obvious. A spiral on a bone, a face carved into ivory, lines scratched into a shell, echoing patterns found continents apart. As the physical world froze around them, the interior world began to thaw, to bloom. We often measure intelligence by tools, but the true hallmark of a transformed mind may not be the spear, it may be the story. Consider what it means to pass an idea across time, folded into sound and gesture. Language is not merely for naming objects, it is for remembering the dead, for planning hunts that have not yet begun, for teaching someone who is not yet born. In the cold void of the Ice Age, this was not a luxury. This was warmth, carried in the breath of shared memory. The paintings of Chauvet, among the oldest known, were rendered in flickering firelight over 30,000 years ago. They are layered, some images redrawn centuries later, as if the cave itself was a living text, edited by generations. The artist used contours of the stone to give animals depth, shadow, motion. They understood perspective. They understood illusion. They understood time. And then there were the hands. Countless human hands stenciled in red and black. Negative impressions where breath met pigment met stone. What do they mean? A mark of presence? A ritual of belonging? An oath? The truth is lost, but their impact is not. To see a handprint left by someone who lived 400 centuries ago is to feel time collapse into touch. It is a quiet reminder. I was here. I saw the same stars. I dreamed too. These images emerged independently in multiple regions: France, Spain, Indonesia, South Africa. Different continents, similar forms. This global convergence hints at something deeper than culture, a shared cognitive awakening. A transformation that may have originated in the structure of the brain itself, a rewiring or perhaps a release, a shift from survival to meaning-making. And with meaning came myth. Though no words survive, myth surely lived in their breath. You do not paint a lion the size of memory unless you believe it carries weight beyond flesh. You do not sing into darkness unless you believe someone, or something, is listening. And you do not imagine unless imagination itself becomes a strategy for life. These weren't decorations, they were maps of the sacred, tools for remembering the invisible, evidence that even when the land offered nothing, the mind could offer wonder, and wonder in that endless winter was its own kind of fire, something astonishing. In the grip of the last glacial cycles, when famine was not a fear but a fact, and death lingered behind every snowfall, our ancestors began to speak not only with mouths but with symbols. They made meaning where none was obvious. A spiral on a bone, a face carved into ivory, lines scratched into a shell, echoing patterns found continents apart. As the physical world froze around them, the interior world began to thaw, to bloom. We often measure intelligence by tools, but the true hallmark of a transformed mind may not be the spear, it may be the story. Consider what it means to pass an idea across time, folded into sound and gesture. Language is not merely for naming objects, it is for remembering the dead, for planning hunts that have not yet begun, for teaching someone who is not yet born. In the cold void of the Ice Age, this was not a luxury, this was warmth, carried in the breath of shared memory. The paintings of Chauvet, among the oldest known, were rendered in flickering firelight over 30,000 years ago. They are layered, some images redrawn centuries later, as if the cave itself was a living text, edited by generations. The artists used contours of the stone to give animals depth, shadow, motion. They understood perspective, they understood illusion, they understood time. And then there were the hands. Countless human hands stenciled in red and black, negative impressions where breath met pigment met stone. What do they mean? A mark of presence, a ritual of belonging, an oath. The truth is lost, but their impact is not. To see a handprint left by someone who lived 400 centuries ago is to feel time collapse into touch. It is a quiet reminder. I was here. I saw the same stars. I dreamed too. These images emerged independently in multiple regions: France, Spain, Indonesia, South Africa. Different continents, similar forms. This global convergence hints at something deeper than culture, a shared cognitive awakening, a transformation that may have originated in the structure of the brain itself, a rewiring, or perhaps a release, a shift from survival to meaning-making. And with meaning came myth. Though no words survive, myth surely lived in their breath. You do not paint a lion the size of memory unless you believe it carries weight beyond flesh. You do not sing into darkness unless you believe someone, or something, is listening. And you do not imagine unless imagination itself becomes a strategy for life. These weren't decorations, they were maps of the sacred, tools for remembering the invisible. Evidence that even when the land offered nothing, the mind could offer wonder, and wonder in that endless winter was its own kind of fire. It warmed not the fingers, but the future. It gave light not to the cave, but to the consciousness within it. For every symbol etched, every song hummed to a child, every myth spoken beneath the howl of the wind, these were not distractions from survival. They were survival. They were the threads that bound a scattered, frightened species into something more enduring than blood, a shared reality. We sometimes forget that the Paleolithic world was not only harsh, it was immense. Groups were small. Contact between bands was rare and often dangerous. But with the emergence of symbolic thought, distance began to shrink. Language became a bridge between minds. Symbol became the seed of culture, a portable worldview. And culture became memory made durable. This was the dawn of recursion, the mind's ability to nest ideas inside other ideas, a story inside a ritual, a metaphor inside a gesture. It is a cognitive trick so powerful, so universal among modern humans, that it defines the structure of language itself. Without recursion, we cannot imagine the future, we cannot speak in conditionals, we cannot dream of gods, but now they dreamed. The rise of symbolic behavior coincides with the birth of the sacred. Burial becomes deliberate, bodies are positioned, red ochre stains the bones, grave goods are laid with care, a shell, a tool, a carved figurine. Objects meant not for the dead, but for what might follow. These are not acts of biology, they are acts of belief. And belief may have been the most adaptive invention of all, to imagine that life has meaning, that hardship has purpose, that the spirits of the forest notice when you leave an offering. This is to create stability where none exists. It is a psychological hearth, a way of managing fear when the world gives no comfort, a way of organizing chaos into something the mind can carry. Some theories suggest that this capacity emerged from mutations in genes like FOXP2, which governs speech and language development. Others trace it to social pressures, the need to coordinate, to cooperate, to deceive. But the result is unmistakable. Around this time, the human brain began to think symbolically, and once it did, there was no going back. From that fire came music. Archaeologists have found bone flutes dating back over 40,000 years. One such instrument carved from vulture bone still plays a clear scale. Someone, perhaps huddled beside the mouth of a cave watching snowflakes vanish into flame, blew air through it and made the sky sing. Why did they do it? Because sound can hold what words cannot. Because even in the bleakest landscape, harmony is a form of hope. Because when the earth is silent, it is the soul's instinct to respond. That response, be it a flute's trembling note, a handprint on stone, or a whispered tale beneath a pelt of stars, became the first kindling of what we might call culture. Not just survival strategies or skill sets passed down through imitation, but entire cosmologies, shared dreams, collective myths. The interior landscape became just as vital as the frozen one outside. And so, the fire in our minds became a gathering place, invisible, but no less real. Around it, communities formed, not just of blood, but of belief. When groups told the same stories, sang the same melodies, etched the same marks on stone, they became more than a collection of individuals. They became we. Identity emerged not from what one could hunt or craft, but from what one remembered, and how one remembered it. These shared memories gave rise to continuity, a sense of past, present, and future braided together. One generation's wisdom could outlive its body. A tale told to a child could ripple outward in time, reaching ears that had never seen the teller's face. And in that way, the dead were not gone. They were present in every gesture, every ritual, every choice. The mind became a vessel for ancestors. This also meant that fear, once solitary, became communal. When a shadow moved in the trees or the reindeer vanished from the hills, it was no longer faced alone. It was faced together, interpreted, woven into narrative, placed inside a meaning larger than any one person. Where there was mystery, there was story. Where there was danger, there was myth. This is not weakness. This is adaptation. Cognitive archaeology shows that once symbolic behaviour appears, it spreads rapidly. Figurines of women, the so-called Venus figures, appear from Western Europe to Siberia. Though their meanings are unknown, their consistency across vast distances suggests a common symbolic lexicon, a language of form that could transcend local dialects. Perhaps they were fertility idols, perhaps they were expressions of awe, perhaps they were talismans of hope. But the deeper truth is this: by giving shape to the formless, our ancestors gave themselves a reason to go on. The Ice Age offered no mercy. It did not reward intelligence. It did not spare the kind. And yet, those who made meaning, who sang, who painted, who dreamed, survived. Not always, not everywhere, but enough. Enough to carry that fire forward, until one day it would leap from cave walls to cathedral ceilings, from bone flutes to symphonies, from whispered lore to the stories we now tell each other across vast digital voids. In every story, even this one, there is a lineage. And that lineage began when the silence of the ice met the voice of the mind, and the mind answered. That answer echoes still. Not in words, perhaps, but in every trace of wonder we carry forward. The poems we write, the songs we hum, the constellations we name. It is there in lullabies and prayer, in the hush of museums and the flicker of candlelight. Though the cave walls are long abandoned, the mind that painted them remains, dressed now in modern skin, holding a smartphone instead of a shard of ochre, but still staring into darkness and asking, what if? This is the inheritance of the Paleolithic, not just tools, but thought, not just survival, but soul. When faced with a world that was cold, merciless and vast, our ancestors did something miraculous. They imagined warmth. They shaped meaning from stone and breath, and in doing so became something new. They became human. And this was not a singular leap, but a slow unfolding, a long listening, a kindling that took millennia to bloom into firelight. Each cave painting, each flute, each myth whispered into frost was a step toward a mind that could hold more than one world at once. The world of what is, and the world of what might be. This duality, this constant balancing of reality and imagination, defines us still. We are the only species that builds futures from fictions, that cries at stories, that sees a storm and speaks to it as if it listens. This is not weakness, it is our oldest strength. The Ice Age tested our bodies, but it shaped our spirits. Even now, science is catching up to what these ancestors intuitively knew. Shared belief knits social groups. Stories synchronize heartbeats. Art releases oxytocin. To dream together is to survive together. Our brains evolved not just to think, but to belong. And through myth, art, music and language, belonging was made visible. And so the fire in our minds kept burning, flickering in lullabies, glowing in the coals of ancient memories, passed like a torch not through blood alone, but through symbol, through story. Perhaps the most extraordinary thing is this. In some way, it never went out. When we gaze at cave art, we do not merely study it, we feel it. The hairs on our arms rise, the air grows still, and for a moment, across 40,000 years, we see not the distance between ourselves and those early artists, but the connection, the quiet thread of shared awareness. We are still that creature in the cave, watching the firelight dance across the walls, telling stories into the dark, and perhaps, even now, the dark listens. We were not always alone. For most of our prehistory, the world was shared, not only with the beasts of the plains or the ice, but with others who walked upright, shaped tools, and perhaps even dreamed in the firelight. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans hidden in the mountain shadows of the East, and perhaps more, ghost lineages now only inferred through spectral fragments in our DNA, unnamed cousins whose bones the earth has not yet yielded. We were one species among many, a branching tree of hominins until the branches fell away. What happens when the last voice of a people goes quiet? The story of our survival cannot be told without the story of their disappearance, because the question is not only how we endured the ice, but why the others did not. Neanderthals were no brutish beasts. They were not evolutionary dead ends dragging their knuckles through a snowstorm. They were human, deeply, recognizably human, with skulls shaped by different millennia, Yes, but brains comparable in size and complexity to our own. They buried their dead. They used pigments, shells, eagle talons. They shaped stone with nuance and hunted with strategy. For hundreds of thousands of years they flourished across glacial Europe, weathering cycles of cold and warmth, expanding and contracting with the changing pulse of the planet. And then we arrived. Some 50 to 60,000 years ago, our ancestors moved out of Africa in waves, carrying with them language, memory, and fire. And as they stepped into new lands, they did not enter an empty world. They entered one already inhabited. In the caves of France, in the highlands of Siberia, in the valleys of the Levant, footprints overlapped, cultures collided. And something happened. Not all interactions were hostile. We know this now not from tools or graves, but from the silent testimony of our own blood. Most people alive today carry traces of Neanderthal DNA, between 1 and 2%, a whisper passed down through tens of thousands of years. In Oceania and parts of Asia, the imprint of Denisovans lingers as well, embedded in genes tied to immunity, altitude, and even the structure of our skin. These were not brief encounters, they were unions, repeated over generations. The story of modern humans is not one of purity, but of entanglement. But the others are gone. Roughly 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil record. Their tools vanish, their bones cease to be buried, their presence fades like breath on glass. The Denisovans, already known only through fragments, a molar, a sliver of finger bone, the ghost of a genome, slip even more quietly into shadow. Why? Was it climate that turned against them? Disease? Competition for resources? Was it violence? Or simply mathematics? The slow erosion of small populations over time? What does it mean to be the last of many? It is a question both scientific and spiritual, because the story of the others, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the unnamed cousins whose faces we will never see, is not one of simple replacement. It is one of inheritance, absorption, and loss. The boundaries between species blur in deep time. The bones do not tell a tale of conquest. They tell one of merging, of gradual vanishing, of memory folding into memory until difference becomes indistinguishable. Some scientists suggest that the Neanderthals didn't vanish in a single catastrophe, but faded through the quiet arithmetic of interbreeding. Small bands, scattered and isolated, met ours, and over generations their descendants became us. Their identity dissolved not through extinction, but through union. If that is true, then the last Neanderthal did not die in battle or hunger, but simply lived and loved, until the word Neanderthal ceased to mean anything separate. Still, traces of competition linger in the record. There are layers of settlement sites where modern human tools appear above older Neanderthal ones, layers that read like the closing of a door. Climate data from ice cores reveals sharp fluctuations around this same period. Sudden cold snaps, retreating forests, collapsing herds. In such volatility, even small advantages mattered. A wider social network, a more diverse diet, a more flexible mind. We do not know if we were the reason they disappeared, but we know we were there when they did, and that knowledge humbles, because to imagine their end is to imagine ourselves reflected in them. They were not monsters in need of replacing. They were kin, beings who had seen fire, who had spoken in gestures and perhaps in words, who had raised children and grieved their dead. The archaeological record shows tenderness, a healed bone, evidence that someone cared for an injured companion long after they could hunt. Flowers laid in graves. These are not acts of beasts. They are acts of mind, of heart. The Denisovans, by contrast, remain almost mythic. We know them not through settlements or art, but through the deep code of DNA extracted from ancient bone dust. Their presence stretches from the Tibetan Plateau to Melanesia, an invisible empire written into chromosomes. Some of their genetic gifts endure in us still: resistance to certain pathogens, adaptation to high altitudes, metabolic traits tuned for survival. They are ghosts, but living ones. And yet, all the while, our kind expanded, from Africa to Asia to Australia to the cold margins of the north. We were small in number but large in imagination. Our tools grew varied, our rituals multiplied, our networks widened until culture itself became an ecosystem, one that could adapt faster than biology. The others had the strength of body. We had the flexibility of story, and in a changing world, story proved stronger. It is a question both scientific and spiritual. Because the story of the others, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the unnamed cousins whose faces we will never see, is not one of simple replacement. It is one of inheritance, absorption, and loss. The boundaries between species blur in deep time. The bones do not tell a tale of conquest. They tell one of merging, of gradual vanishing, of memory folding into memory until difference becomes indistinguishable. Some scientists suggest that the Neanderthals didn't vanish in a single catastrophe, but faded through the quiet arithmetic of interbreeding. Small bands, scattered and isolated, met ours, and over generations their descendants became us. Their identity dissolved not through extinction but through union. If that is true, then the last Neanderthal did not die in battle or hunger, but simply lived and loved, until the word Neanderthal ceased to mean anything separate. Still, traces of competition linger in the record. There are layers of settlement sites where modern human tools appear above older Neanderthal ones, layers that read like the closing of a door. Climate data from ice cores reveals sharp fluctuations around this same period. Sudden cold snaps, retreating forests, collapsing herds. In such volatility, even small advantages mattered. A wider social network, a more diverse diet, a more flexible mind. We do not know if we were the reason they disappeared, but we know we were there when they did. And that knowledge humbles, because to imagine their end is to imagine ourselves reflected in them. They were not monsters in need of replacing, they were kin, beings who had seen fire, who had spoken in gestures and perhaps in words, who had raised children and grieved their dead. The archaeological record shows tenderness, a healed bone, evidence that someone cared for an injured companion long after they could hunt. Flowers laid in graves. These are not acts of beasts, they are acts of mind, of heart. The Denisovans, by contrast, remain almost mythic. We know them not through settlements or art, but through the deep code of DNA extracted from ancient bone dust. Their presence stretches from the Tibetan Plateau to Melanesia, an invisible empire written into chromosomes. Some of their genetic gifts endure in us still. Resistance to certain pathogens, adaptation to high altitudes, metabolic traits tuned for survival. They are ghosts, but living ones. And yet, all the while, our kind expanded. From Africa to Asia, to Australia, to the cold margins of the north. We were small in number but large in imagination. Our tools grew varied, our rituals multiplied, our networks widened until culture itself became an ecosystem, one that could adapt faster than biology. The others had the strength of body. We had the flexibility of story. And in a changing world, story proved stronger. Because story is not merely entertainment, it is structure. It binds time. It teaches what cannot be explained by instinct alone. It can move faster than evolution, faster than climate, faster than catastrophe. It is portable, malleable, endlessly duplicated. And in the frozen world of the late Pleistocene, that made all the difference. We do not know the stories the Neanderthals told, if any. We do not know their myths or their fears or their gods. Perhaps they had them. Perhaps their memory rituals were sung in low tones around coals, their cosmologies scratched into bark or spoken through hands. But whatever they passed on, it did not pass far enough. Their stories ended. Ours did not. And here we stand, thousands of generations later, with those stories still unfolding, reshaped, retold, renamed, but unbroken. That continuity is not just cultural, it is biological. When you close your eyes, parts of your brain may still echo with traces of Neanderthal or Denisovan origin. A flicker in the way your immune system responds to viruses, a wrinkle in the gene for keratin, a whisper of endurance in high mountain air. Their lives are folded into ours, but something else is folded there too, the weight of being alone. To be the last surviving species of a once vast lineage is a quiet, haunting kind of victory. Not triumphant, not clean, just enduring. Our family tree was once a tangle of branches, Australopithecines, Homo habilis, Homo floresiensis, Homo erectus, Homo naledi. Some of them we walked beside. Some vanished before we rose. Others, Like the Neanderthals watched us arrive, now only one branch remains, ours, and the question arises, is this a triumph or a tragedy? In the Pleistocene, the answer would not have been obvious. Our numbers were still low. We were not yet conquerors of the biosphere. We had not yet drowned the world in light or pierced the skies with metal. We were clever apes with stone blades and bone flutes, scratching meaning from scarcity. We were many things, but not inevitable. The disappearance of the others was not destiny, it was contingency. 1,000 small chances strung together, glacial pulses, viral outbreaks, failed births, narrow crossings, strange alliances. If history had shifted by even a breath, we might have been the ones to vanish. And if they had survived, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the others, how would the world have looked? Would we have shared it, fought for it, learned from one another? Would cities be built by 4 kinds of humans instead of 1? Would myth be richer, war more complex, peace more difficult? We will never know. All we can do is look back through time's fog at the footprints beside our own, and remember, we were not always alone. To be the last is to carry a burden, not of guilt necessarily, but of memory. And memory is a strange and heavy thing, especially when it is incomplete. We carry bones, fragments, genomes. We carry the echoes of faces we've never seen. But more than that, we carry the awareness that once there were others like us, and now there are not. What happens when your cousins disappear? If you've ever lost someone close, not just to death, but to drift, to silence, to time, then perhaps you understand a shadow of this feeling. The slow realization that something once familiar is now gone, and that you are now the sole witness to what once was shared. Our ancestors likely didn't know they were becoming the last. There were no declarations, no ceremonies, just the gradual emptying of the world, a season without new neighbours, a year without familiar tracks in the snow, a cave found abandoned, with embers long cold. The others disappeared not with a scream but with a sigh, and we kept walking. But here is the haunting twist. Even as they vanished from the world, they remained within us. Mitochondrial studies reveal the intimacy of our shared past. Not only did we interbreed, we carried forward their legacy. Their blood runs in ours, though diluted by time. Their genes rise in certain populations linked to traits we're only now beginning to understand. Altitude tolerance, immune response, brain development. Even today, your genome may be marked by traces of ancient love or ancient loneliness. This genetic haunting challenges how we define ourselves. If Homo sapiens contains Neanderthal and Denisovan echoes, are we truly one species, or are we the result of many? It is tempting to simplify, to draw neat lines between us and them. But biology doesn't obey our desire for clarity. Evolution is messy, and history more so. The truth is, we are a braided river of ancestry. And perhaps what made us thrive was not separation but synthesis. Still, the silence remains. There are no Neanderthal cities, no Denisovan languages, no oral traditions from Homo floresiensis passed down through generations. The Ice Age kept their stories frozen and eventually forgotten. We live in the long shadow of their absence, a silence that grows sharper the more we learn. We find their remains in caves and sediments, extract their genomes, model their faces from bone and dust, but they cannot speak back, and so we speak for them, not in conquest, but in tribute. Because to be the last is not only to survive, it is to remember, and through remembrance we give the others one final gift, to not be erased. In the silence of museums and the chill of excavation sites, in the still rooms where ancient DNA is teased from crumbling teeth, in the soft brushes against stone tools lying buried for 40,000 years, they return not as relics, but as participants in our story. Not as failed experiments, but as part of the scaffolding of who we are. Because the story of human evolution is not a ladder. It is not a race we won. It is a branching, meandering forest path, full of crossings and dead ends and hidden turns. The others did not fall behind. They simply took different trails, ones that, for a time, ran beside ours, until they didn't. And here, in the quiet of now, we stand in the vast clearing they helped create. To imagine them clearly is to feel the nearness of deep time, You, sitting in this moment, listening perhaps with earbuds on a night bus, or falling slowly to sleep, carry their history within your cells. Your breath is not only your own, it belongs also to them, the others who breathed this earth before us. To know this is to be haunted, gently. We sometimes ask why they vanished, but rarely do we ask what they were like. Not just how they looked, but how they saw. Did they laugh? Did they fear the dark? Did they have words for hope, or names for stars? Did they gather around fires in the long glacial night telling stories of spirits and snow? We may never know, but perhaps in our stories their shadows linger. Perhaps in every myth of lost peoples, every tale of forest spirits or forgotten tribes, there is an echo of memory far older than we understand. Perhaps the ache we feel when looking into the deep past is not simply wonder, but recognition. Because we are not just a species of survival, we are a species of remembering, and memory, like fire, must be tended. It can warm, illuminate, preserve, but it can also be extinguished. What we forget disappears again. And so we speak of the Neanderthals and Denisovans not as curiosities, but as kin. We look at their stone tools, their hunting wounds, their DNA, and we see not them, but us, earlier. The others may have faded, but their fading is part of the light that shaped our dawn. So the next time you walk under starlight, or sit quietly before flame, or speak aloud to the emptiness, remember that once this world held many kinds of humans, and for a while we walked it together. Only one remains now. But in remembering the others, we remember something truer about ourselves. They did not choose greatness. They did not seek conquest. They simply stayed alive. In a world swallowed by ice, where the winds clawed down from the glaciers like the breath of forgotten gods, a few small bands of humans found warmth in the forgotten places, tucked between mountains and oceans, between memory and myth. These were not the empires of later ages, not the cities or states etched into stone. These were the hidden sanctuaries of survival, the quiet lungs of humanity breathing in the dark. The earth had drawn its breath and held it, locking the seas in frozen fists, stretching the ice sheets as far south as Britain and as far north as Patagonia. What warmth remained was rare and precious, a dwindling resource like the last embers of a fire, and yet embers can ignite futures. Where would you go if the world itself seemed to close in around you? The answer, for many of our ancestors, was south, to the margins, to the places the glaciers could not reach. Southern Africa, the Sunda Shelf of Southeast Asia, the Levantine Corridor, Australia's coastal arcs, all became unlikely cradles of endurance. These weren't just places on a map. They were refugia, isolated pockets of habitability, ecological shelters carved into the larger harshness of the Ice Age. What made them special? They were often warmer, yes, spared the full force of glacial cold, but more than that, they offered continuity. Along coastlines, marine ecosystem pulsed with life when inland plains turned to dust. Shellfish, seaweed, fish shoals, simple, rich, dependable food chains that asked only for ingenuity, not war. Human groups who clung to these edges began to weave their lifeways around the tides and rocks. They made tools not just of stone, but of bone and shell. They marked time by moon and wave. They left behind middens, dense accumulations of discarded shells, that now stand as fossilized diaries of survival. What does it mean to survive? Not through strength, but through rhythm. The rhythm of waves, the rhythm of seasons, the rhythm of hands passing knowledge down across uncountable generations. In places like Blombos Cave on South Africa's southern coast, ochre-stained stones whisper of symbolic behaviour nearly 100,000 years ago, long before cave art lit up Europe. Here, the sea was not an enemy, it was kin. It gave not only food, but meaning. But survival was not merely biological, it was cultural. Because to persist in fragmented groups, scattered and surrounded by uninhabitable cold, meant finding new ways to bind minds, new ways to tell who you were, new reasons to stay. So they carved and painted and sang. They lived not in cities, but in stories. And in that fragile intimacy of warmth, water, and each other, they endured. To endure meant to adapt, not just to the land, but to its moods. These refugia were not paradises, they were thresholds. narrow fluctuating zones between too much and not enough. Along the southern coasts of Africa, humans learned to read the ocean's pulse like a second language. Low tides revealed mussel beds. The turning of the seasons told when fish would spawn, when whales might pass. Every stone, every shell, every tide pool held knowledge, and knowledge became survival. In the submerged lands of the Sunda Shelf, now hidden beneath the waters of Southeast Asia, human communities threaded through a vast exposed landscape of rivers and coastal plains. During glacial periods, sea levels dropped over 100 meters, transforming island chains into connected corridors. What is now Borneo, Java, Sumatra, these were once joined, offering a supercontinent of lush forest and mangrove, teeming with life. Elephants roamed there, so did tigers and early humans. In the Levant, the ancient crossroads between Africa and Eurasia, small groups clung to the thin ribbon of land that remained habitable, nourished by Mediterranean rains and fertile valleys. Caves here hold traces of nearly uninterrupted human presence, like footprints pressed deep into time. From this bottleneck, perhaps, emerged not just survival, but migration, the tentative, determined spread of Homo sapiens into Europe and beyond. But what makes these refugia truly astonishing is not just their environmental shelter, but their genetic continuity. In our bones, we carry maps. Genetic studies reveal that the people who took shelter in these regions are not just ancient shadows, they are ancestors. Today's genetic diversity bears their fingerprints. The mitochondrial DNA passed from mothers to children carries lineages that trace back to these sanctuaries. Some haplogroups found in modern southern African populations represent the oldest unbroken human lines ever recorded, markers of an unbroken breath stretching over 150,000 years. In other words, they did not vanish into myth, they became us, and this matters. Because the story of humanity is not a straight arrow, not a march from primitive to advanced, from caves to skyscrapers. It is a mosaic of small survivals, of scattered groups who held on to fire and song and memory long enough to meet again. The southern coastlines, the highland forests, the coral bays, these were not edges, they were hearts, quiet, beating, unseen, but vital. They remind us that the centre is not always where we expect it to be, that civilization's cradle may not lie only in floodplains or fertile crescents, but also in wind-carved cliffs and tidal flats, and that the most powerful stories are not always shouted. Some are whispered, across generations, across glacial epochs, across salt and shell, waiting to be heard again, and when we listen closely, not with the urgency of conquest, but with the stillness of attention, we begin to hear them. Not as voices exactly, but as patterns, as echoes in ochre and flint. Across these coastal shelters, signs emerge of a species not just surviving, but thinking, deeply, symbolically, beautifully. In the southern tip of Africa, caves like Blombos and Sibudu reveal more than hearths and bones. They reveal intention. Ochre stones were etched with crosshatch patterns, not random scratches but deliberate marks, repeated, preserved. Perforated shells stained with pigment hint at personal ornamentation, perhaps even identity. Compound adhesives used to haft tools suggest forward planning, an understanding of chemistry, a cognitive leap. These were not the marks of desperation, they were the signs of imagination. Why, in the midst of climatic collapse, would a human paint a shell or carve a pattern? Why, when calories were scarce and winters long, would time be spent in symbolism? Perhaps because survival isn't only about the body, it's about meaning. In these small coastal bands where kinship was fragile and memory had to travel by voice and firelight, art may have been a lifeline, a way to bind people across time and space, shared symbols, shared songs, shared ways of seeing the world. And the sea, ever shifting, became a mirror for that inner world, always changing, always returning. Even in Southeast Asia's Sunda Shelf, where ancient humans ranged through dense coastal jungles and river deltas, archaeological traces suggest continuity, long-term presence, inherited knowledge, adaptation across changing climates. In caves in Borneo and Sulawesi, red hand stencils and painted animals appear, some over 40,000 years old, among the oldest known symbolic art in the world. This was not a localized phenomenon. This was a pattern, a kindling of cognition wherever humans clustered and endured. and again genetics confirms what art suggests. Modern populations in these regions often retain unique lineages, evidence that their ancestors were not wiped away, but carried forward, generation after generation. The genetic landscape of Oceania, for example, reflects deep time separations stretching back tens of thousands of years, held in place by isolation, but preserved by continuity. In a way, these refugia were not just shelters, they were crucibles, places where pressure and scarcity honed not only tools but minds. Where the necessity of close cooperation in small groups favoured the emergence of empathy, memory, storytelling, all those soft skills we now call humanity. And as glacial centuries crawled on, these scattered bands would not stay scattered forever. Eventually the ice would begin to pull back, rivers would return, forests would creep outward, the seas would rise again. But in the meantime, deep in their temporary sanctuaries, humans were preparing for more than survival. They were preparing to remember. Because memory is what allows the past to survive its own ending. When the Ice Age finally began to loosen its grip, slowly, imperceptibly over thousands of years, it was not a triumphant march but a gentle thaw. Lakes reappeared where there had been ice, trees returned to valleys long silent, and the sea, held back for millennia, began to rise, creeping into the lowlands, swallowing the old coastal plains, reshaping the continents we now know. But what it covered in water, it left behind in people. The genetic traces of those who lived in refugia are not only preserved, they are active, flowing in our bloodstreams today. In southern Africa, the San peoples, often called Bushmen, carry mitochondrial lineages that may be the oldest continuous ones on Earth. Their DNA holds the echoes of those who sheltered by the sea 150,000 years ago. In the forests and islands of Southeast Asia, the deep ancestry of populations still reflects ancient separations. From times when humans first walked the exposed lands of Sunda and Sahul, and what makes this so quietly profound is not just the age of these lineages, but their persistence. These weren't great empires. They left no monuments, no pyramids, no great walls. They left shells, pigments, bones, songs, but that was enough. Enough to survive glacial centuries. Enough to carry knowledge across tens of thousands of years. Enough to pass the thread forward, unbroken, though sometimes frayed. In these refugees, where the land held its breath and people spoke in the hush between waves, culture didn't collapse. It deepened. Traditions rooted in tidal rhythms, in the cues of birds and stars, became oral constellations, ways to remember how to live, how to move, how to gather and hunt and grieve and rejoice. These were not static shelters. They were dynamic, generational ecosystems of memory. And even as sea levels rose and pushed people inward, those memories moved with them. Inland, upslope, into new valleys, new forests, the stories adjusted, but the soul remained. And isn't that what survival truly is? Not just staying alive, but staying recognizable to yourself? It's worth pausing here, as we pass through the fog of deep time, to notice how rarely this part of the story is told. We celebrate the migrations, the inventions, the painted caves of Europe, but we often overlook the quiet brilliance of those who stayed, who endured not through exploration, but through deep attunement, who didn't spread out but rooted down. In the end, both were necessary, the wanderers and the stayers, the fire starters and the fire tenders, because without refuge there is no return, and without the ones who remained, who kept the breath of humanity alive through long nights by the southern sea, there would have been no one left to remember at all. And so, the great paradox of human endurance reveals itself, that in the age of ice it was not the conqueror who triumphed, but the caretaker, not the one who overcame nature, but the one who aligned with it, who listened more than spoke, who watched more than wandered. The southern refugia were not only geological accidents of climate, they were human testaments to patience, resilience, and profound interdependence. In these hidden places beneath stone overhangs and mangrove canopies, humans did not impose themselves upon the world, they dissolved into it. They became students of the tide, interpreters of the wind. The coastline was not simply a place to eat, it was a place to become, and what they became would echo into the future. Some would eventually leave, carrying their stories into greener lands as climates warmed. Others would remain, continuing the lineages and traditions that still live in scattered forms in indigenous communities today. Their languages, their songs, their rituals, even after centuries of disruption, retain faint outlines of that ancient rhythm. And still, the sea waits. The very waters that once receded to expose life-saving land now lap quietly over submerged memories. Ancient camps, now drowned. Stone tools, now silted beneath the surf. The Sunda Shelf, once a continent, is now an ocean. The southern coasts of Africa, where shell middens once rose like cairns, are eroding slowly into the salt. But the memory is not gone. It never is. Memory doesn't live in monuments, it lives in gestures, in the way hands shape tools, in the way elders speak of stars, in the way a child watches the moon rise and knows, without needing to be told, that the tide will follow. This is cultural inheritance at its most intimate, its most human. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of the Southern Sea, that survival is not always heroic, it is often gentle, it is often small, a basket of shellfish shared with kin, a song passed from mother to child, a cave wall painted with symbols whose meanings are lost, but whose presence says, "We were here, we endured." In the narrative of prehistory, we often look for the climactic, the migrations, the extinctions, the explosions of art or war. But sometimes, the heart of the story lies in the margins, in the overlooked, in the places where people simply stayed alive, stayed connected, stayed human. So, as we look back from our modern vantage point, from a world shaped by cities and satellites, let us not forget those who found their way through the deep cold by walking slowly, by listening, by learning the land's language. In their silence there was speech, in their stillness a kind of movement, and in the shelter of the Southern Sea, humanity found not just refuge, but itself. The cold could strip forest from the hillsides and drive animals south. It could freeze rivers in their beds and bury entire landscapes beneath silence. But it could not freeze the hand, nor the memory that lived inside it, nor the impulse to shape, to etch, to make something, not just to survive, but to signal that we were here. For in the frostbitten world of the Upper Paleolithic, something extraordinary happened. Our tools, once just extensions of the body, and began to carry stories of the mind. What does it mean to remember with your hands? Somewhere, perhaps in a wind-sheltered hollow near the edge of a glacial corridor, a woman kneels beside her child and shows how to notch a sliver of flint. The edge is sharp enough to slice tendon, light enough to throw, delicate enough to fracture in precise ways. But she doesn't just teach technique. She passes on something older, a lineage of decisions, a philosophy of edges. The child learns not only how to make a blade, but when to make it, why to make it, what it means to make it. And in that slow inheritance, something more than survival is being transmitted. A culture is unfolding silently in the shaping of stone. Why did our tools begin to change so quickly? From the time of Homo erectus, we had known how to make hand axes and scrapers. For more than 1 million years, our ancestors shaped bifacial stones with astonishing consistency. And then, suddenly, in geological terms, the pace accelerates. We begin to craft bone harpoons, fish hooks, throwing spears, and composite weapons that fuse stone, wood, sinew, and resin into a single engineered whole. In some places, especially in Africa and the Levant, we even find tiny microliths, slivers of stone so small and precise they could be set into wood like teeth into a jaw, forming barbed arrows or knives. These were not the products of brute necessity alone. They were expressions of a new kind of mind, a mind not content to react, but one that could anticipate, envision, abstract, a mind that understood not just what a material was, but what it could become. That could see a straight twig and imagine a future fish. That could see a jagged edge and dream of clean hide and warm fire. And behind that vision lay pressure, not just environmental but social. For each tool was no longer only a private solution. It was a public declaration, a symbol. Could you recognize someone's tribe by their blade? In the archaeological record, patterns begin to emerge. Distinct toolkits cluster in specific regions. Some styles spread, others vanish. Certain techniques, like the pressure flaking of obsidian or the groove and splinter method of bone carving, appear only in certain places, only for a time. This is culture made tangible. A flint tip becomes more than a blade. It becomes a dialect, a fingerprint, a whisper that says, "We were here. This is how we survived. And this is how we remembered." Because every tool is a conversation between generations, one that doesn't need words. In every flake struck from stone, in every groove shaped by bone, there is an echo of a hand that learned from another hand. A skill repeated so many times that the gesture itself became a kind of memory, encoded not in DNA, but in rhythm, in movement, in touch. This was cultural memory, the earliest form of inheritance beyond blood. Archaeologists sometimes call it technological continuity, but that phrase is too pale for what it truly means. These weren't just patterns of technique, they were lineages of thought. The very act of tool-making bound people through time, not only within a single lifetime, but across hundreds of generations. The flint napper striking a core in one glacial valley could unknowingly be repeating the same precise gestures her ancestors had performed 50,000 years earlier. Gestures perfected by hands she would never meet, hands turned to dust. But the memory was still alive, and as these gestures passed forward, they carried more than utility. They carried imagination. Because each new innovation, the first bone needle, the first barbed spear, the first harpoon, began as an act of vision. Someone looked at what already existed and thought, what if it could be more? A small bone, hollowed and sharpened, became a sewing needle, one of the most transformative inventions in human history. Suddenly hides could be tailored into clothing fitted to the body. Exposure to the cold lessened, life expectancy grew. But this wasn't only a triumph of function, it was also a triumph of imagination. To pierce and thread, to bind skin to skin, that was both practical and symbolic. It stitched people to the world. The same was true of composite tools, spears with detachable tips, handles bound with sinew, hafts sealed with resin. These required not only technical skill, but planning, memory, and collaboration. To make one meant to gather multiple materials from multiple places, to think several steps ahead. The mind had to simulate outcomes, anticipate fractures, understand cause and effect across time. It was, in essence, the birth of design thinking, and so the tool became not just an instrument but a teacher. In the workshop of the Ice Age, the open tundra, the windswept plain, the fireside clearing, tools taught humans how to think recursively, to shape one thing in order to transform another. They trained the brain to connect process with purpose. In that way, every chipped stone was a rehearsal for language, for story, for art. The mind that could make a microlith could also imagine a god. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath every ancient blade and bone. They were not only tools for the hunt, they were instruments of becoming. Because with each tool crafted, humans did more than survive the Ice Age. They etched identity into matter, and once a tool bore the trace of identity, it was no longer just a thing. It was a marker, a story, a piece of someone's self. Imagine, for a moment, a hunter carving a delicate groove into the shaft of her spear, not because it makes the weapon fly straighter, but because it reminds her of the river bend where she first learned to fish. That groove is memory, its intention, and it turns the spear from an object into a relic of belonging. This symbolic layering of tools, the way function began to blur with meaning, is one of the earliest signs that our ancestors weren't just thinking creatures, but remembering ones. They carried their past not only in their minds, but in the things they made, and those things, passed from hand to hand, became carriers of collective memory. In some cases, entire communities were defined by the tools they shared. Across glacial Europe, for example, the Magdalenian people left behind intricate bone harpoons, needles, and carved antler points, artifacts so refined that they suggest a deep tradition of shared craftsmanship. These weren't one-off inventions, they were stylistic signatures, repeated and refined across generations. They showed not just how people made things, but who they were. Just as language has dialects, so too did tools. A barbed spear in one valley might differ subtly from one in another, not because one was better, but because each reflected a different way of being in the world, culture expressed through material, identity etched into form. And when these objects were traded, gifted, or buried with the dead, They carried that identity across landscapes and lifetimes. But tools did more than define the group. They also connected individuals across vast chains of knowledge. For one person to know how to carve a fine needle or shape a compound blade, someone had to teach them, and someone taught that person, and someone taught them. This is the invisible thread of cultural transmission, a lineage as real and vital as any genetic one. And like all transmission, it required memory. But not just the memory of how, also the memory of why. Knowing how to strike flint is different than knowing when, or where, or for whom. These layers of knowledge accumulated like sediment in the minds of each generation. What emerged was not just a skill set but a worldview, a philosophy shaped by stone and bone, sharpened through hardship, and passed through stories, gestures, rituals. And so a tool was never alone. It belonged to a family of ideas, each one held, refined, and released into the world like breath into a flame. Each tool lit the way forward while remembering where we had been. In this way, tools became more than instruments of use. They became symbols of continuity, evidence that we were not alone, that we came from somewhere, that others had made and shaped and taught before us. In the bleak quiet of the Ice Age, when survival could feel like the only constant, this continuity meant everything. It offered not just knowledge, but meaning. It told people, you belong to something that began before you and will continue after. Some of the tools found at Upper Paleolithic sites are so beautifully crafted, with ornate carvings, smooth symmetry, and materials transported from far-off places, that they seem to defy the desperate conditions of the age. Why decorate a spear thrower if you're starving? Why shape a carving knife into the shape of an animal if the hunt is uncertain? Because humans are not simply survivors. We are storytellers. We shape meaning into matter even when, especially when, the world seems to unravel. In fact, the need to imbue things with meaning might be most urgent when life feels fragile. A carved symbol on a bone handle or a precisely balanced arrowhead becomes a reassurance. We are still here. We still know. We still remember what it means to be us. And perhaps it was this, the binding of identity into tools, that allowed our ancestors not only to endure the Ice Age, but to outlast it. For when you know how to make a thing, you also know how to make your way through the world. And when the thing you make carries your story, it can guide others long after you're gone. Consider the way technologies travelled, even in a world with no roads. Certain styles of blade, ornamentation, or hafting techniques appear across vast regions, from southern Africa to the Levant to parts of Central Asia. These aren't coincidences, they're echoes. Traces of contact, migration, exchange. A stone blade might travel farther than the person who shaped it. It might be picked up, examined, imitated, and so ideas moved, riding on the back of matter. In this way, tools became our first messengers. Long before we etched symbols on cave walls or pressed pigment into stone, we carved meaning into function. Our blades were also books. Our harpoons, a kind of language. Our awls and axes, teachers of intention. Every time someone chipped or carved or bound a tool, they were repeating not just a pattern of motion, but a pattern of thought. It's easy to think of prehistory as silence, as if people then had no inner lives, no philosophies, no sense of identity. But their tools say otherwise. They show minds capable of nuance, beauty, foresight, hands that remembered, and minds that dreamed. Even when words were few, the work of the hand spoke volumes, and the message was always the same: we are still becoming. Even now, in our world of glowing screens and synthetic polymers, we are surrounded by the descendants of those first tools, the ones shaped in icebound shelters, beneath sky-wide constellations, beside fires that hummed like low thunder. Today's machines, devices, weapons, instruments, they're all part of that lineage. But where once a blade was held in a single hand, made with patience and passed with care, today's tools often pass without thought. They come and go. They are made to be forgotten. And yet, some things persist. In museums and dig sites, tucked beneath layers of earth and time, the old tools still rest. A blade shaped from obsidian 30,000 years ago still gleams with its original edge. A bone needle still bears the marks of its maker's pressure. These objects are not broken. They are waiting, not for use, but for recognition. for someone to look at them and say, "I remember you, even if I was never there." Because somewhere in your brain and mine is a memory we didn't make ourselves. It was given to us, not genetically but culturally. The way we intuit how to hold a pen, the way we know how to slice, to point, to shape. These are gestures as old as humanity, passed through unbroken lineages of making and remaking. Our hands still remember the tools, even if we forget the names. This is what it means for a tool to remember the hand, and it's why the story of technology is not merely about invention. It is about intimacy, about how humans poured their minds into matter, not just to survive, but to express, to belong, to endure. Each tool is a fingerprint of thought, a residue of attention, a shape that once lived in someone's mind, made real through effort, practice, and intention. Think of what that means, that across tens of thousands of years, someone not unlike you, anxious, tired, dreaming, human, once sat beneath a sky of ice and stars and made something, not just to hunt or to stitch, but to be understood. They passed that thing to someone else, and that someone passed it again, and again, until the motion of that first hand became the whisper in yours. You are not standing at the end of a story, you are in its middle. The tools you use today, the objects you shape, the ways you solve problems, the things you carry in your pocket, all of it lives in the same tradition, the same lineage, the same long memory. And if we're careful, and if we listen, and if we shape what we make with intention, then perhaps the tools we leave behind will also remember us, not just for what we built, but for what we believed, and for how we became. The ice did not simply melt, it screamed, and the sky, once hushed by cold, broke its silence with thunder. For tens of thousands of years the world had been held in stillness. Great white sheets blanketed the continents, thick as mountains, heavy as time. Glaciers carved valleys as deep as memory, sealing life into isolated pockets, a long and brittle quiet. But even silence is a kind of tension. Beneath the frost, heat gathered, and when it surged, it did not ask permission. It fractured continents, it drowned the lowlands, it tore through the frozen bonds of an ancient order and whispered a new law: change, whether you wish it or not. What happens when an entire planet shifts its breath? The last glacial maximum had marked the zenith of ice's dominion, but as Earth tilted, as greenhouse gases rose in slow and mysterious pulses, the grip of the cold began to loosen, first in trickles, then in torrents. Glaciers began to retreat, and with them, the shape of the world. Rivers swelled with meltwater until they broke their banks in vast, churning floods. The weight of the ice had pressed down the land. Now, relieved of its burden, the crust itself rebounded, rising like bruised skin slowly healing. The seas responded in kind. They climbed, they roared, they swallowed. How many human footprints now sleep beneath drowned continental shelves? The coastlines of the world shifted like lines drawn in sand. Forests advanced where tundra had stood. Animals moved or vanished. Human memories, if they were carried at all, had to move with them. But this was not a gentle thaw, it was a reordering. The climatic pendulum did not swing cleanly from cold to warmth. It faltered, it recoiled, it lashed out. Roughly 12,900 years ago, just as the Earth was warming, something happened. Something strange. The planet, so recently awakened from its long glacial sleep, plunged back into cold. Not for centuries, but for over 1,000 years. This event, the Younger Dryas, remains one of the most dramatic climatic reversals in recent prehistory. What triggered it? A meltwater pulse that disrupted the Atlantic's great oceanic conveyor. A comet, perhaps, shattering the calm of the skies. Theories abound, but the sky remains reticent. What does it mean when the future flickers? Uncertain, even to the stars. For those alive during the Younger Dryas, the return of cold would have been a bewildering betrayal. Landscapes once lush with rebirth froze again. Patterns of migration, trade and settlement fractured. Ecosystems recoiled, and with them the fates of those who depended on their rhythms. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths, names that read like myths but once breathed the same air, began to disappear. Their bones would rest in peat and permafrost, waiting for millennia, waiting to be found. What breaks first? The climate, or the creatures it no longer serves? Humanity, still fragile and few, found itself in a world where every gain could vanish overnight, and vanish it did. The paths that had seemed promising, lush valleys, rich coasts, rivers flush with melt, turned perilous once more. The renewed cold shrank habitable zones, fractured ecosystems, and rerouted the very seasons. Where once green shoots had emerged, frost now curled their tips. Where once prey had gathered near predictable waterholes, they vanished into the silence. The rhythm of life grew staccato, unpredictable, jarring, and sometimes fatally out of tune. The Younger Dryas was not a singular catastrophe. It was a slow unravelling, a 1,000-year pause in the Earth's warming heart. But for those living through it, it must have felt like a turning away, as if the world had promised change, and then remembered its cold indifference. Even the sky turned hostile. Winds tore through unshielded plains. Lightning split forests already weakened by cold. Storms surged from oceans swollen with meltwater. It was a time of elemental unrest. In the midst of this, the great beasts, the megafauna that had dominated the Ice Age, began to vanish. Across continents, extinction swept like a shadow. The mammoths of Europe and Siberia, the mastodons of the Americas, the giant ground sloths and saber-tooths, all disappeared within a geological heartbeat. In their place, silence. In their place, the smaller, the quicker, the more adaptable. The earth, in its grief or its indifference, began to favour those who could bend with the wind rather than stand against it. Why did they vanish? There is no single answer, no single villain. Climate change, sudden and unrelenting, surely played its role. But some scholars point to us, Homo sapiens, as the harbinger. We had spread across the continents like fire across dry grass. With tools and tactics, with language and cooperation, we had begun to shape ecosystems around ourselves. Perhaps the great beasts, slow to reproduce and bound to narrow niches, simply could not adapt quickly enough. Or perhaps the land itself could no longer support them, its productivity shattered by the swings of ice and fire. But if the giants died, we endured, and that endurance came at a cost, for while the world changed, so did we. The chaos of the Younger Dryas didn't just shift landscapes, it reshaped the inner landscapes of those who survived it. The instability bred vigilance, the cold bred caution, and the unpredictability of the sky taught a new kind of reverence, one mingled with fear. The heavens, once a source of calm predictability, now cracked open with the memory of betrayal. Even today, in the myths of distant peoples, you can still hear echoes of this time. Tales of floods that swallowed the earth, of beasts that vanished into snow, of skies that darkened without warning. These are not merely stories. They are ancestral memories, fossilized in language, preserved in rhythm, passed like tools from tongue to tongue. They remind us, the earth remembers its tempests, and sometimes it speaks them back. Even in places far from the epicenters of glacial retreat, echoes of this instability reverberated. Lakes swelled and broke their bounds, carving new valleys in hours. Earthquakes rippled where once there had been silence, as the pressure of rebounding continents unlocked tectonic memory. Entire coastlines vanished, swallowed by a sea that no longer recognized its former borders. What had once been homeland became seabed. What had once been sacred ground now belonged to the fish. It is difficult for us, insulated by civilization's illusions of permanence, to imagine a world that changed so quickly, not once, but over and over again. The people of that time lived in a kind of perpetual impermanence. Campsites became flood zones. Animal herds vanished with a season. A fertile valley in one generation became a glacial moraine in the next. Adaptation was not a skill. It was a sentence. And through it all, the sky. Watching. Changing. Breaking open. The celestial patterns, once relied upon for navigation, for planting, for prayer, began to feel less like clockwork and more like coincidence. In this turbulence, fear and awe became indistinguishable. Stars once thought to be steady began to shimmer strangely in smoke-filled skies. Eclipses, comets, meteors. The sky offered signs, but no guarantees. It no longer promised order, only attention. Out of this came story, and story was survival. In the midst of such chaos, humans turned to meaning as they turned to fire, to see in the dark. Oral traditions began to thread these new, bewildering changes into cosmology. Flood myths emerged in cultures separated by oceans, tales of fire from the sky, of battles between cold and warmth, of animals who spoke before vanishing. These were more than entertainment. They were mnemonic devices, warnings, emotional maps drawn by ancestors for future wanderers of the earth. And the warnings were not always heeded. In North America, vast kill sites of mammoths suggest mass hunts that may have pushed populations past recovery. In Australia, the disappearance of the giant wombats, the thunderbirds, and the massive lizards suggest a lethal mix of human expansion and climatic collapse. The line between survival and extinction was not always clear, not then, not now. But even in this epoch of destruction, creation did not sleep. With each crisis, new behaviours arose. People began storing food, not just gathering, but planning. They built more permanent shelters. They tracked the seasons with greater urgency. And in some cases they moved, far and fast. From the shrinking margins of glacial Europe, across land bridges, along coasts, up rivers and into forests, they spread again. Not in triumph, but in necessity. They carried their children and their stories. They carried the old songs and the new fears. They carried tools shaped by vanished animals and hopes shaped by shifting stars. The world was broken open, and they stepped into its fracture, not as victims, not yet as masters, but as witnesses, witnesses to a world cracking and reassembling itself in real time. In the teeth of climate chaos, memory became the most valuable inheritance. Not just the memory of where the animals moved or where the rivers ran deepest, but of how to adapt when nothing remained the same. Knowledge had to be mobile now, transferable not through written script, but through performance, through song, through ritual, through the quiet teachings passed between hands under the open sky. The evidence of this adaptive genius lies buried in strata and stone. As the great ice retreated northward, new landscapes opened, but they were not empty. Meltwater pooled into colossal freshwater lakes, like Lake Agassiz in North America, which at its peak held more water than all the Great Lakes combined. These lakes occasionally breached their ice dams in events so cataclysmic they reshaped entire drainage systems. When Lake Agassiz released one of its final outbursts around 8,200 years ago, global sea levels may have surged by meters in mere months. In such moments, the sea was not a distant boundary, it was a devourer. In this unstable world, those who clung to coastlines also walked the knife edge of destruction. Yet coastlines were lifelines. They offered fish, shellfish, and other marine resources that could be relied on when inland game vanished. Archaeological sites like those at Monteverde in Chile or the Japanese archipelago suggest that some human populations rode the tides of change, literally, using boats, or at least watercraft, to follow shifting ecologies along the edge of the known world. But water is not only a route, it is a mirror. Many cultures born of this age began to weave water deeply into their cosmologies. Floods became foundational myths, purging and cleansing, but also creating. The sea became a mother, a grave, and a teacher. In origin, stories from Aboriginal Australia to the Near East, we hear whispers of the same truth, that the earth is not ours to control. It turns, it rises, it consumes, and we, for all our cleverness, are simply passengers on its long voyage. Yet our cleverness mattered. The Younger Dryas ended as suddenly as it had begun. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures rose once more, and this time the warmth held. Forests returned, grasslands widened, the earth exhaled, but something in the human spirit had changed. Those who emerged from this crucible were no longer just surviving the Ice Age. They were imagining futures beyond it, planning generations ahead, domesticating plants, staying in one place, watching the sky, not for disaster but for pattern. And perhaps this is the true legacy of the sky that broke its silence. It forced us to listen, to read the weather not only in the clouds but in the bones of the land, to treat the planet not as a backdrop but as a conversation, at times hostile, at times tender, always unfinished. The dialogue between Earth and its inhabitants did not begin with language, it began with listening, and when the ice receded for the final time, it left behind more than meltwater and reshaped coastlines. It left behind new questions, about time, about change, about permanence. It asked, "What will you make of a world that does not stay still?" Our ancestors answered with memory, etched into stone, sung beneath stars, napped into obsidian and bone. They mapped what they could not explain, and in the face of a world that had proven itself capable of erasure, they dared to imagine continuity. They marked solstices with stones. They watched the sky with new attention, not to control it, but to learn its rhythm. The emergence of early calendars, lunar tracking and horizon markers suggests that the great chaos of the Younger Dryas left a lasting imprint on the human sense of time itself. We began to think not only in days and seasons, but in cycles. The Earth had changed, but so had we. The fragility of our species during the worst of the Ice Age had given way to something else. Resilience, yes, but also foresight. In place after place, archaeology reveals a shift in how we interacted with the land. More selective hunting, evidence of land management, early plant cultivation. Where once the future had been a storm cloud, now it began to resemble a seed. The skies calmed. Rivers stabilized. In Mesopotamia, in the Nile Valley, along the Indus and the Yangtze, something remarkable began to unfold. Settlement. Not as brief encampments, but as long-term rooted ways of life. And though the true birth of agriculture still lay ahead in our story, its first breath can be heard here, in the softening silence that followed the retreat of the ice. But even now, deep in our DNA, the memory remains, not only of suffering but of adaptation, not only of storms but of the songs sung to outlast them. And if we have learned anything from the long arc of the Pleistocene, it is this, that change is not the exception. It is the law. The world will shift again. The sky will break its silence again. We will be asked, as we were asked before, not only how we live, but how we listen. And if we listen well, as our ancestors once did in the hush between ice and flood, perhaps we will remember that survival is not merely persistence, it is transformation. The Earth has told its story in glaciers and fire, in extinction and bloom, and we, small and soft and dreaming, have dared to reply, not with dominance, but with wonder, not with certainty, but with song. We survived because we listened, we endured because we remembered. And we continue because we are learning, still, to live in a world that always becomes something new. Even before we knew what history was, we were already writing it, with our feet, with our breath, and with our hunger for something more than survival. The melting of the great northern ice was not a moment, but a movement, a slow and stuttering unfreezing that released not just water, but the world itself. Glaciers, ancient and stubborn, groaned and withdrew. Valleys once strangled by silence filled again with the voice of rivers. The land remembered its green. And humans, thinly scattered, quietly enduring, began to walk again. Not away from the cold, but toward a future they could not name, toward the far edge of the known. What does it mean to move when there is no map? What kind of memory is etched not in stories, but in instincts deeper than language? As the earth softened beneath their feet, our ancestors rose and began to follow invisible lines across continents. They crossed steppes the size of empires, deserts that glittered with mirages, forests so dense they swallowed light. They climbed and descended mountain chains that tore across the horizon like frozen waves. But it was not conquest. It was not escape. It was continuity. A return to the motion that had always defined us, from the first footprints pressed into volcanic ash to the ghost trails along the southern coasts of Asia. They were not migrants in the modern sense. They were walkers in a world still being born. The vastness ahead was not an obstacle, it was a mirror. In every stretch of empty land there was the possibility of home. In every horizon line the echo of an older longing. Why did they move? Perhaps because stillness was too much like extinction. Perhaps because the body remembers what the mind forgets, that we are not creatures made to be bound. The archaeological record trails after them like smoke, stone points that once met bone, hearths ringed with fire-scorched stones, ochre-stained campsites beside vanished rivers. And yet, what survives is not only what they left behind, but what they carried forward. Their tools evolved, yes, but so did their imaginations. A culture on the move is a culture alive, forced to adapt, to reshape its myths, to recalibrate its memory to each new skyline. The winds of change were not always kind. Ice may have released the land, but it did not release its grip on the climate. The younger Dryas, a sudden freeze within the warming, would bring drought and disruption. And still they walked, and they walked far. Across the grassy plains of Eurasia, down the river arteries of what is now China, into the humid tangle of Southeast Asia. Foot by foot they traced routes that today span oceans and nations. In the widening wake of their movement, the human world expanded, not with cities, not yet with agriculture, but with presence, with story, with survival. What happens to a species when the earth itself becomes its canvas? And how do you navigate a world whose edges are always receding? The answer, it seems, was already written inside us. Migration was not an invention, it was an inheritance. The instinct to move, to seek, to follow the faint rhythm of the earth was older than our species. Long before we made maps, we carried directions in our bones, and as the ice loosened its grasp on the world, this ancient compass stirred awake again. To the north, the great plains of Eurasia unfurled, an open corridor stretching from Europe to the farthest reaches of Siberia. It was here that small bands of humans began a journey that would last generations, a journey that would eventually lead them to the farthest edges of the world. They followed herds that migrated with the seasons, traced rivers that cut through melting tundra, and rested in caves where wind and flame sang of continuity. Some never returned. Others did, bearing new stories, new tools, new ways of understanding distance itself. At the eastern end of that vast corridor lay a world suspended between continents, Bergengia. It was not yet a strait but a bridge, a continent in its own right, a frozen steppe of grass, mammoth, and wind. For thousands of years it connected Asia and the Americas, but more than that, it connected time to patience. Here, between worlds, humanity waited. The Bringian standstill, as geneticists call it, was not a single moment, but a long pause, perhaps thousands of years in duration. A people poised between past and future, between the familiar and the utterly unknown. What did they think, those who lived on the edge of two continents? We cannot know their language, but we can imagine their silence. The glacial winds that cut across the mammoth steppe, the endless twilight of Arctic summers, the feeling of standing at the threshold of something vast and unfinished. For them, the New World was not yet a destination. It was a horizon, a whisper, a dream told in the direction of the sunrise. And still, even in the waiting, they remembered how to move. They built tools adapted to the cold, microblades, bone awls, harpoons for hunting seal and fish. They tamed fire against the long, unending night. And when the climate shifted again, when the ice sheets finally pulled back and the coasts opened, they followed the water's edge southward. Some crossed inland, through passes of glacial stone. Others followed kelp forests along the Pacific coast, where the sea was generous and the land forgiving. Each step was a sentence in the story of becoming, and the story, though vast, was made of small, repeating acts. A hand grasping a child's wrist to help them cross a stream, a fire lit at dusk on new soil, a memory retold of the land behind them, already becoming myth. These acts were the architecture of endurance. And from endurance came belonging. Not belonging in the sense of ownership, for the people of this time did not possess the land in the way we later would. Their belonging was softer, quieter, a mutual recognition between body and earth. The land gave water, warmth, and game. In return, the people remembered its contours, respected its seasons, told stories in its honour. Where they stopped for a season, they learned the winds. Where they settled for a generation, they etched their knowing into cave walls, riverside paths, and trails still faintly visible in the satellite imagery of today. Across the Americas, this silent expansion unfolded like a murmuration, fluid, organic, and wondrous. From the ancient mammoth kill sites of Clovis to the coastal middens of Monteverde in southern Chile, human presence shimmered outward in every direction. Each discovery of a new hearth, each ancient footprint in mud or peat, tells us the same thing. They were there, and they were human. Entire continents were not conquered, but absorbed, felt through the soles of bare feet, named in songs and mapped with the constellations. Yes, they had stars. And yes, they remembered. The skies of early Homo sapiens were not empty. They were textured with meaning. Just as we once followed the migrations of caribou, we also followed the turning of Orion, the arc of the moon, the hidden clockwork of seasons and solstices. Navigation, for these people, was a kind of poetry. They travelled not by compass, but by patterns. The wind's tone, the angle of the sun, the call of birds, the smell of distant rains. 1,000 sensory cues, learned and passed on not with instruction, but with presence. Knowledge was not taught, it was lived. It was inherited not in books, but in bodies. This kind of memory, embodied collective, made it possible to cross deserts, scale mountain passes, traverse the frigid taiga, and it made each group uniquely attuned to their environment. The people who walked the high Andes developed lungs shaped by altitude. The people who hugged the Pacific coastlines developed tools for fish and tide. No single migration, no single direction, just an endless braid of paths, choices, chances. The migrations into Australia too had already happened, long before the Americas. Tens of thousands of years ago, people crossed the island-hopping chains of Southeast Asia and reached the Sahel landmass, a combination of what is now Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea. These crossings required boats, navigation across open water, knowledge of islands over the horizon. These were not primitive wanderers. These were deliberate explorers. They moved not because they lacked roots, but because their roots were in motion. Their history was not written in stone, but in distance, in the space between campsites, between constellations, between the remembered voice of an elder and the shape of a distant mountain. This was the human story in motion, not linear, not finished, but unfolding. And it was still unfolding. Every step added new verses to an ancient song, one hummed softly beneath breath, passed down not as instruction, but as rhythm. And though the walkers themselves did not think in maps or borders, their presence reshaped the earth, in footprints pressed into volcanic ash, in bone needles lost in forest loam, in pollen grains displaced by their fires. They walked not to dominate, but to inhabit, and in inhabiting, they changed the planet gently, like water over stone. As the world warmed, ecosystems bloomed in their wake. Grasses returned to thawed steppes. Forests thickened across Europe and North America. With each new region came new relationships, with animals, plants, seasons. The reindeer became less common, the red deer more familiar. In North America they met the now extinct horses and camels. In the Amazon basin they moved beneath towering canopy, harvesting fruits unknown to the African cradle that bore them. The world had changed, and so had its humans. Yet remarkably, through all this movement, through millennia of foraging, fishing, of carving paths through deserts and ice fields, something held, a thread, not just of blood, but of memory. Migration did not erase identity, it refined it. Each group, each band of a few dozen or 100, held within them echoes of the motherland, the mythic Africa of beginning. And though their languages diverged, their rituals adapted, their tools shifted with need, the human signature endured. We see it in ochre handprints in South American caves, identical in gesture to those in France. We see it in burial rites that span continents, in the reverence for the sky, for fire, for bones. Wherever they went, they brought meaning with them, and that meaning was often carried in the body, scarification patterns, ornaments made of shell or stone, hairstyles, tattoos, clothing sewn with sinew and bone. These were more than decoration. They were maps of belonging, inherited compasses etched onto skin. A child raised in the western steppes of Eurasia would have learned not only to hunt with the bow, but to recognise the stories painted on hide, the songs sung to stars that rose at springtime. These were not luxuries. They were survival. Culture was the memory of what worked and what mattered. Still, the land was never static. Even as people settled new regions, they remained responsive to the Earth's slow movements. Sea levels continued to rise, severing land bridges. The vast plains of Beringia, once home to patient wanderers, slipped beneath waves. Islands became isolated, climates oscillated, Forests encroached on grasslands, and with every shift humanity adapted, not just physically, but spiritually, because to migrate was not just to move. It was to reimagine the world again and again, and this ability, to remain grounded while always in motion, became perhaps our most powerful inheritance. The long walk into the world wasn't only a dispersal of bodies, it was a dispersal of consciousness, of presence, of wonder. The planet itself became a canvas for our becoming, and our footprints, though scattered, still point forward. Even now they surface, in drying lakes, in thawing tundra, in sand dunes peeled open by wind. A line of toes crossing the Pleistocene mud of White Sands, New Mexico, tell of a young adult walking with a child on their hip, pausing occasionally, sometimes returning, always continuing. 15,000 years ago, perhaps more. The prints are clear, human, yours. If you squint through time, we forget that history is not always written in stone. Sometimes it is written in salt, or ash, or memory. And memory, real, ancestral memory, is not always verbal. The people who spread across the world in this long, slow exhalation of humanity did not leave behind many words, but they left behind knowing, they left behind practices. We still feel them in the instinct to follow rivers, to walk when things no longer make sense, to seek warmth and water and wide skies when the world narrows. It wasn't conquest, it wasn't escape, it was return. A return to something we never truly left. The call to move when the earth moved. The trust that meaning is found not only in destinations, but in the journey itself, in the curve of the land, in the hush before dawn, in the endless pattern of footsteps echoing behind and ahead. And if you think about it, we are still walking. Our migrations now are different, traced in fibre optic cables and satellite signals in highways and airline routes. But the hunger is the same, the deep, quiet pull to find somewhere that feels like home, and if not home, then something close enough. Somewhere we can name, somewhere the stars look familiar. In the deep past they navigated by those stars, not because they needed perfect accuracy, but because it felt like continuity. The sky did not speak in words, but in repetitions. The arc of Orion in winter, the rise of Venus before dawn, the Milky Way's river of light. To know the stars was to remember, and to remember was to survive. This, then, was the real miracle of the post-Ice Age world. Not just that we moved, but that we remembered as we moved, that we wove continuity into motion, that we stayed human, even when everything else, climate, fauna, landscape, was changing. And in doing so, we painted the earth with stories, not just on cave walls, but in routes taken, campsites shared, mountains named. A map of becoming, drawn not in ink but in breath, in the quiet persistence of a species that refused to stay still, not because it couldn't, but because the walk itself was sacred. So the long walk into the world wasn't a departure, it was an arrival, one that's still happening, one that, in a quiet way, is happening even now. As you listen to these words, as your thoughts drift to distant places, to people you've never met and stars you've never named, the journey, you see, is still yours. The genome remembers what history does not. For every monument we did not carve, every language we never wrote down, every face that faded before the clay could catch its impression, there is still a whisper, a thread, a flicker of presence woven into the fabric of our cells. And sometimes, when the silence of prehistory is too absolute, it is not the bones that speak, but the blood. You, listening now, carry within you the signatures of strangers, ancients you never met, whose names you'll never know, whose eyes never saw the sun rise over the cities we live in now, people who sang into the wind before it had a name, and yet they are with you, etched into the nucleus of every cell, humming in your mitochondria, folded into your chromosomes like marginalia in a book handed down through thousands of generations. How do we know? Because the genome tells a story far older and more complete than anything carved into stone. A story of forgotten love, of breath traded across firelight, of bodies buried in snow and never exhumed. When geneticists began sequencing ancient DNA, not only from modern humans, but from the bones of the ones who came before, they stumbled into a revelation so strange it bordered on myth. Modern humanity is not one lineage, but many braided together. Some of those threads we expected. Neanderthals, whose skulls we had cradled for over a century in museum glass, left unmistakable marks, not only in our bones, but in the blueprint of who we are. Up to 2% of the genome of every non-African human alive today comes from Neanderthals. That much we had begun to suspect, but others were ghosts. The Denisovans were discovered not through a full skeleton nor a painted cave wall, but from a shattered finger bone. Found in a Siberian cave at the edge of the Altai Mountains. No toolkit surrounded them, no settlements, just fragments, genetic echoes, and a mystery. Their DNA did not match Neanderthals, and yet it was clearly human. A sister lineage, long overlooked, and yet when compared to the DNA of modern populations, something extraordinary appeared. High levels of Denisovan ancestry live on not in Europe, nor in the icy north, but in the islands of Melanesia. In the faces of highland Papuans and Aboriginal Australians, in people separated from that Siberian cave by oceans and epochs. How? When? Why? No one knows for sure. But the genetic memory remains, silent and irrefutable. These are not legends, they are not spirits. They are biological truths, ancestors without names, peoples without monuments, civilizations whose firelight we will never fully imagine, yet who breathe on in us. What does it mean to be the vessel for the dead? To walk through life with the footprints of forgotten others pressed into your every cell? What happens when the story of who we are includes those we never meant to remember? It means that identity, this quiet illusion of singularity, begins to dissolve. Because in the mirror of ancient DNA, there is no pure humanity. There is only drift, mixture, survival. We are not descended from a single line of upright walkers, but from overlapping waves of people who touched, merged, and vanished. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, nearly 5% of the genome can be traced to Denisovans. Not a faint echo, a strong voice, a signal so loud that it hints at deep sustained contact. Not just one moment of encounter, but generations of coexistence and reproduction, now sunken beneath the soil of time. And there are more. In South Asia, East Asia, and even in indigenous American populations, we find scattered pieces of Denisovan DNA, suggesting that there were not just one group but possibly many Denisovan lineages, spread across a continent and lost to history. The Denisovans might not have been a single people but a mosaic themselves, a ghost nation composed of ghost nations. It challenges our notion of extinction. For if they live on in us, are they truly gone? And still, the story deepens. In 2020, geneticists found signals of another population, one that doesn't match any known ancient group. A mysterious ghost hominin, as it's often called. Their DNA is visible in modern West African populations, but we have no bones, no artifacts, no name, only the imprint in our genome, like a signature on a letter we were never meant to open. They were real. They loved, hunted, built. And then they were gone. Or maybe, like the others, they never truly left. Our genomes, yours, mine, everyone listening, are archaeological sites. Within each of us is a palimpsest, overwritten, layered, sacred. You were never a single story. You're a library of ancestors who once gazed at stars, who made tools from bone and stone, who sang to children who would not remember their names. And yet, within the curled double helix, there are still songs playing. It's tempting to see this as strange, but it is more honest to say, this is normal. This is what it means to be human. We are not a species that emerged cleanly and alone. We are the survivors of networks. Collisions, and love stories too old to retell. Perhaps that is what makes us modern, not the tools, not the art, but the fact that we carry so many echoes. The modern human is not the end point. We are a bridge, a chorus. In the quiet language of genetics, we are each the descendants of those who remembered how to endure, but also of those who disappeared. And still, in each generation we ask, how much of them remains? The answer is not measured in bones, but in the subtle resilience of traits. A gene that helps the body process low oxygen more efficiently, found in the Tibetans who live in the thin air of the Himalayan plateau, can be traced to Denisovans. That gene, EPAS1, allows cells to function in conditions that would challenge most others. It is a whisper of evolutionary intimacy, an ancient gift passed down from people who once breathed the same mountain winds. Similarly, Neanderthal contributions may have influenced how our immune systems respond to pathogens, how we perceive pain, and even aspects of our skin and hair. These are not decorative details. They are functional remnants, pieces of survival strategies that have folded into the complex origami of the modern body. But not every trace is beneficial. Some Neanderthal DNA is associated with increased risk for certain diseases, from type 2 diabetes to depression. The past does not always bless us. Sometimes it haunts. Inherited burdens can echo just as deeply as inherited strengths. Still, the deeper truth is that these traces do not divide us. They connect us. The concept of race dissolves under the gaze of ancient DNA. The further we peer into the past, the clearer it becomes. There are no distinct categories, only gradients. Humanity is not a tree with separate branches, but a braided river, always flowing and always mixing. And so, when we say that someone carries Denisovan ancestry, or Neanderthal DNA, or the ghost signature of an unknown hominin, we are not saying they are less human. We are saying they are more fully human. Because to be human is to carry multitudes, even ones we do not remember. This recognition reframes the way we look at migration, at difference, at ourselves. The movements of ancient peoples were not neat, not linear. They were complicated, overlapping, recursive. They left behind a record not in clean skeletons but in fractured footprints and genetic patterns traced through time. We have spent so long trying to draw boundaries as who belonged, who was us, and who was them. But the genome shrugs off those distinctions. It tells us that us has always included them. It whispers that the earth was never silent, that the lands we call empty were once loud with languages we'll never know, that every ocean crossing, every cold night, every shared firelight left a trace. And in the genome, if we know how to listen, those traces still speak. To carry forgotten blood is not to carry burden or shame. It is to carry memory, a memory older than writing, older than stories, older than names, and perhaps in some distant sense, this memory remembers us in return. It remembers in the curve of a jaw, in the way certain hands cradle tools, in dreams we cannot explain, in instincts we never learned. Not metaphorically, biologically. Within each of us are cellular whispers of extinct species who shaped our responses to altitude, hunger, climate, light. Every heartbeat is choreographed by a cast of vanished actors. And still, science has only scratched the surface. Most of the ancient hominin genomes we carry have not yet been identified. We can see their shadows in the data, clusters of genetic sequences that do not match anything we've found in fossils. These ghost populations challenge us not only to widen our maps of prehistory, but to accept that much will remain unknown. In West Africa, for example, certain populations carry genetic variants that appear to come from a hominin lineage entirely separate from Neanderthals and Denisovans. There is no archaeological trace of them. No tools, no teeth, no paintings in caves. Only their code, locked within ours, speaking across millennia without a voice. This is not the narrative of conquerors. This is not a story of one group replacing all others. It is the opposite. A story of survival through union, of contact, not conquest, of thresholds crossed in silence and intimacy. Every pairing, every child born of difference was a quiet vote for the future, for continuity over extinction. These were not isolated events. They were patterns of movement, of mingling, of reaching out across language, shape, lineage. Sometimes those encounters were fleeting. Other times they left enduring legacies in our blood, our bones, our breath. And this too has consequences beyond science, because the deeper we look into the human genome, the more it resists simplicity. The idea of a single origin point grows blurry. Humanity did not emerge like a flame lit in one place. It arose like fire leaping from torch to torch, spreading light wherever it caught, sometimes dying out, sometimes catching again in places long thought cold. We carry this fire, but we did not start it. Instead, we tend it. Each generation adds to the lineage, fans the embers. Even now, with the tools of modern genetics, we are only beginning to realize just how ancient and entangled our inheritance truly is. It is not a straight line we follow. It is a web. And within that web, we are not alone. in every cell, in every person alive today, is an archive not only of what we've endured, but of who we've been. The multitude of forms, faces, and fates that merge to make us. It's humbling, and it's beautiful, and perhaps, most importantly, it means that none of us are ever only ourselves. We are walking mosaics, collections of ancient hopes, of experiments in survival, of alliances and accidents. The human form, far from being a finished sculpture, is a layered palimpsest, each generation inscribing over the last, while never fully erasing what came before. Within us are the contours of a face that once looked out over Ice Age valleys, the reflexes of hunters who knew how to listen to the wind, the calm breath of mothers who kept fires lit while glaciers loomed at the edge of the world. These are not simply poetic imaginings. They are testable truths, affirmed by the sequencing of our DNA and the patterns found in populations across the planet. The more we learn, the more we realize how little of our story was ever linear, or pure, or isolated. The word modern, as applied to humans, begins to feel misplaced, even small. We are not modern, we are timeless. And the story of our species is not the rise of one perfect form, but the survival of many forms, interwoven. Each extinction a tragedy, yes, but not always a vanishing. Sometimes it was a quiet merging, a becoming. This chapter in our journey teaches us not just about the past, but about the present. It urges humility in the face of identity. It asks us to see others not as strangers, but as continuations. To look at difference not as divergence, but as testimony, proof that we are shaped by one another, forever. And when we walk through the world with that knowledge, we walk differently. We see that to harm another is to harm a relative, that every kindness is also a kind of homecoming, that in the long, winding passage through time none of us arrived here alone. We are not the first, we are not the only, we are not even entirely ourselves. We are children of forgotten blood, blood that endured, blood that wandered, blood that built memory from ash and breath. And somewhere, in a cave now buried, in a song long vanished, in the unspoken trust between ancient beings who once shared a night sky, something began. A lineage that would lead, step by step, to this moment. To you, listening, alive, carrying more than you know. The first time in over 100,000 years, the earth exhaled a gentler breath. Not warm, not yet, but no longer cruel. The glaciers paused their march. The great white beasts of the north hesitated at the edge of retreat. In the silence that followed, something ancient stirred. Not in the land, but in the bones of those who had learned to survive when the world itself seemed determined to forget them. This was not a return. It was not a restoration. It was an invitation, quiet, steady, and slow, extended by a planet beginning, at last, to show mercy. What does it mean for the earth to become kind? For more than 10,000 generations, humanity had moved with the rhythm of suffering, clutching warmth where it could be found, following herds across crumbling tundra, fishing through coastal fogs while the wind howled like a god unappeased. Seasons were blades, storms, sentences. But somewhere around 11,700 years ago, the blade began to dull. The Holocene epoch began not with fanfare, but with a silence that thickened slowly, year after year, across forests, rivers, and the faces of those who had never known a spring without fear. Rain fell and did not freeze. Trees leafed and did not die. The ice began to retreat and astonishingly did not return. This was not just climate. It was structure. It was memory laid down in mud and pollen, in layers of lake bed sediment telling the same story across continents. The sky calmed. The wind slowed. The chaos that had once pulled weather like a thread unravelling the world now gave way to a stability so rare, so improbably smooth, that entire civilizations would rise upon its shoulders without realizing how precarious their balance had become. But before those civilizations there were still the walkers, the gatherers, the fishers, the watchers of stars. To them this gentle change was not data. It was the faintest shift in scent on the wind. It was the deeper stillness in the soil when planting a root. It was the strange and unfamiliar question, what if we did not move this season? For the first time, perhaps, that question could be answered with something other than hunger. In Anatolia, in the Levant, and along the banks of the Nile and the Tigris, bands of humans began not just to settle, but to stay. Seeds were not just eaten, but placed with intention. Fields were not only for foraging, but for shaping. The earth, long an enemy, now became something like a partner. And so they experimented. They risked memory in place of movement, trust in place of wandering. Did they know what they were doing? Likely not. But when the rains returned in rhythm, when the seasons arrived in order, when the river did not vanish into dust or flood into ruin, something extraordinary became possible, a second kind of survival, one not just of the body, but of the home. What does it mean to belong somewhere for the first time in human history? It means that memory begins to settle, not only in the mind, but in the land. It means that footsteps once scattered by wind and migration now deepen into paths, into grooves, into roads not yet named. The Holocene did not gift abundance all at once, but it offered the rarest gift of all, time, and with time came attention. No longer racing the ice, no longer counting days between storms, early humans could begin to observe, not just to react. They noticed the swell of fruit in a particular season, the return of birds to familiar trees, the way certain seeds would root if placed in moist ground, and slowly they began to shape not only tools, but patterns that would become culture, and culture eventually that would become place. Somewhere in the highlands of southeastern Turkey, at a site we now call Göbekli Tepe, circles of stone began to rise, not dwellings, not shelters. These were temples, or something like them, structures built not from necessity but from meaning. Their builders were not yet farmers, not yet city dwellers, yet they carried in their minds a vision of permanence. It is a contradiction almost impossible to grasp. The earliest great monuments of human imagination were raised not by the agricultural civilizations they predated, but by people still rooted in the memory of movement, people who had only just begun to hear the whisper of stillness. Meanwhile, in the Fertile Crescent, people began to plant with more precision. Wheat and barley were no longer seasonal accidents but cultivated companions. Goats were not just hunted, they were kept. The world was changing, and for the first time in 100,000 years, it was not in rebellion but in cooperation, or so it seemed. But nature's mercy was not without condition. The Holocene was stable, yes, more stable than anything our species had ever known. But it was not infinite. Even within its rhythms there were droughts, floods, and unpredictable years. The risk of staying, of settling, was that failure now meant more than hunger. It meant the collapse of a fragile experiment. The margin for error, once spread across migratory distances and seasonal dispersals, was now contained in a single valley, a single harvest, a single river's rise or fall. And yet the gamble continued. Along the Yellow River, the Nile, the Indus, the Euphrates, small settlements multiplied. Clay huts gave way to brick, gardens to fields. The air grew thick not only with smoke and ash, but with songs meant for more than one lifetime. Myth and memory began to braid. Children grew up knowing only one sky. And so, home, that oldest yearning, became not a destination, but a reality. The earth had not simply calmed, it had invited us to dream. And dreams, once given a steady place to land, began to take root in forms no longer shaped by wind or carved by hunger. With the dream of home came the dream of tomorrow, of seasons that could be predicted, of foods that could be stored, of lives that might outlive their own storytellers. In the slow rhythm of the Holocene, a new kind of time was born. Time not measured by the chase, but by the seed, the field, the cradle. This transformation was not merely physical, it was cognitive. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had evolved to survive uncertainty. Our tools, our myths, even our social bonds were forged in the crucible of unpredictability. But now the world asked us a different question. Could we survive stability? The answer came in pieces. In the Levant, where grains grew tall and animals lingered, settlements like Jericho began to rise. Walls were built, not only against threats, but against impermanence. Storage pits appeared, granaries, places where the future was hoarded in kernels and guarded with care. The past had taught us to fear scarcity. Now we feared loss in a different shape, the loss of what we had worked to keep. Ownership began to solidify, and with it, the beginnings of hierarchy, of division, of civilization's first uneasy shadows. Still, it is important to remember that this was not some sudden leap into modernity. The people of this early Holocene world were not unlike their Ice Age ancestors in mind or spirit. What had changed was the tempo of life and the canvas upon which human possibility could be painted. The stories told by firelight now extended beyond a single season's hunt. They spoke of lineages, of ancestral lands, of the gods who dwelled in hills or followed the stars. Oral traditions deepened, becoming more rooted, literally and symbolically, in place. The dawn of agriculture was not a uniform march either. It was scattered, piecemeal, a tapestry woven from many threads. In China's Yangtze Basin, rice was cultivated in wetlands. In the highlands of Papua, tubers were tended in damp soils. In Mesoamerica, maize began its long journey from wild grass to cosmic symbol. Each region developed its own rhythm with the earth, a unique dialogue between climate, biology, and culture. But the common theme, the universal pulse, was this: staying. And staying brought with it a new set of tools: the sickle, the hoe, the grindstone, the fence, and the hearth. These were not the tools of travellers, but of architects, people beginning to shape not just shelters, but systems, patterns of planting, calendars carved into bone or stone, communal rituals timed to solstices and rains. The earth was no longer merely a stage for survival. It had become a partner in a slow, unfolding choreography. This was not the end of hardship, far from it, but it was the beginning of something more than endurance. It was the beginning of intention. To intend, in this sense, was to imagine more than the next meal, to imagine a life stretched across seasons, across generations. It was to plan for children not yet born, to shape the land not for oneself, but for those who might one day walk it. In this still young Holocene world, a profound shift was taking place. Humans were no longer merely responding to nature. They were beginning to reshape it in their own image. Yet the calm of this new era was not without its cost. Abundance brought with it a delicate dependence. Where once mobility had shielded us from collapse, allowing scattered bands to leave barren lands behind, now we were tethered to the success or failure of a single place. A dry season could mean famine, a spoiled harvest, despair. The seeds that promised life also demanded obedience, and in this tension, a new vulnerability emerged. Some communities adapted with resilience. They learned to diversify, to store grain for lean years, to rotate crops, to domesticate animals not only as food, but as partners in survival. Others clung to older ways, moving with the rhythms of wild herds, gathering where forests still offered gifts. The earth, even in its kindness, had not become uniform. It offered choices, and with those choices came divergence, between those who stayed and those who still wandered. But perhaps the most poignant transformation was internal, for with settlement came new kinds of questions, not about where to go, but about who we were and who we belonged to. Identity, once a fluid reflection of movement and kinship, now rooted itself in land. One story became tied to a valley, a river, a mountain visible on the horizon. And with this rootedness came the first whispers of us and them. Boundaries began to form, not only in the soil, but in the mind. The idea of territory emerged, of belonging to a specific stretch of earth and defending it against those who did not. The calmness of the Holocene had invited humans to settle, but in doing so it also sowed the early seeds of conflict. It was not yet war as we know it, but it was the first rumble, a quiet claiming of place, of resource, of memory. And yet, in parallel, another thread wove itself through this time. The very same stability that allowed for division also nurtured cooperation. Villages formed kinships, networks of trade emerged, linking salt from the deserts with obsidian from volcanic highlands. Pottery spread, not only as containers, but as art. Decorative motifs travelled alongside practical goods, whispering stories from one region to the next. The world was becoming more interconnected, even as it was becoming more divided. In this delicate paradox, the Holocene held its most enduring lesson, that kindness from the earth was not a guarantee, but a question. And it was we, humans, recently thawed from ice and hunger, who would answer it, in the choices we made about how to live together and how to remember the land that had allowed us to begin again. The Holocene, for all its stillness, was never a silent era. It spoke in gentle rains that nourished the first barley shoots, in the muddy footprints of children born to homes that didn't move, in the quiet hum of human voices that stayed in one place, long enough to deepen into ritual. And perhaps most of all, it spoke in memory, not the memory stored in genes or napped into flint, but the kind told beside hearth fires and carved into stone. This was the beginning of story not just as survival, but as legacy. Myths bloomed like flowers in this fertile calm watered by wonder. They told of animals who gave their lives to humans, of sky beings who brought seasons, of ancestors whose bones had become the hills themselves. In every tale, the natural world was not separate from the human. It was kin, guide, spirit. These stories did more than explain the world. They tethered us to it. And as the earth grew kind, we built more than tools. We built meaning. We raised stones in circles aligned to solstice suns, painted ochre suns on cave walls even after the snow had long since melted. In Göbekli Tepe, before metal, before writing, we carved vultures and lions into megaliths, not to guard grain or assert power, but to speak with the sacred. Before kings or cities, there was reverence. But kindness, like fire, is fragile. The bounty of the Holocene was not infinite, and our new way of life, settled, abundant, multiplying, placed pressure on the land that had nurtured us. Forests fell for fuel, rivers were diverted, wild animals, once co-inhabitants, became strangers, and still we grew. More people meant more mouths, more labour, more stories, and eventually more control. Hierarchies emerged. Some stored grain, others served. Inequality, once muted by the shared hardship of Ice Age survival, began to rise in tandem with wheat. This too was part of the invitation, not just to rest in the earth's kindness, but to face the choices it offered. The Holocene asked us, would we remember that we were shaped by hunger, by cold, by fragility? Or would we mistake abundance for invincibility? The answer, of course, is not one answer. It echoes differently in every place, in every century that followed. But here, at this dawn, 11,000 years ago, humanity stood on a knife's edge, not of extinction, but of transformation. We had survived the worst the planet could hurl at us. Now, the question became, could we survive ourselves? In the hush that followed the melting, in the green bloom that spread where glaciers had once clawed, the earth extended a hand, not as master, but as partner. And we, in our infant civilization, took that hand. What we did next would shape the millennia. But for now, the earth was kind again. And we remembered how to breathe. It begins, as so many human stories do, with water. Not a trickle, but a deluge, a rising, a swallowing, a world undone in waves. Long before written language captured the bones of history, long before kingdoms rose and calendars counted the days, we remembered the sea. It came suddenly in story, in rhythm, in grief. It came through the mouths of elders and the carvings of priests across continents and cultures with eerie familiarity. A flood that ended one world and began another. And in nearly every ancient tale, it was not merely water that surged. It was judgment, rebirth, revelation. What does it mean that peoples from the mountains of Peru to the floodplains of Mesopotamia, from Aboriginal songlines to the Vedas of India, all carried the same refrain? That once, everything drowned. Are these simply the myths of agriculture's dawn, metaphor for chaos, for the unpredictability of nature in the time before the plough? Or are they something more? The encoded whispers of memory itself, born from eyes that once watched the shoreline disappear. At the end of the last ice age, as the world warmed, oceans rose not in storms, but in centuries. The glaciers, once locked in silence, melted like spilled time, releasing trillions of tons of water back into the world's veins. Shorelines crept inland, slow but unstoppable, submerging valleys, swallowing coasts. Places once walked were gone, not in a moment, but in a generation. And yet for those who lived there, whose homes were the low-lying deltas, the fertile fringes, the change felt apocalyptic. What does survival look like when the land itself forgets its shape? To remember such loss, not in stone, but in story, is an act of reverence. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of Utnapishtim, warned by the gods to build a great boat and carry life upon it as the waters rose in divine fury. In the Hebrew tradition, Noah is given a similar charge. In India, Manu is guided by a divine fish to escape the flood. In Mesoamerica, it is the wrath of gods cleansing the world for its next rebirth. And in each, there is a warning, not just of rising seas, but of forgotten duties, of lost balance between humanity and the cosmos. Could these myths be rooted in reality, not as literal boats or rains, but as ancestral echoes of deglaciation? In the Black Sea Basin, researchers have found evidence of a sudden and massive inundation around 7,000 years ago, where Mediterranean waters surged north through the Bosporus, swallowing what may once have been habitable plains. Was this the flood behind the tale, or was it one of many? How many apocalypses have been forgotten by time, remembered only in the voices that tremble at the edges of myth? And if these stories are memories, not metaphors, what else have we encoded in legend waiting to be heard again? To tell a myth is not to lie. It is to translate experience into the language of meaning. Our ancestors did not carve sea levels into stone or etch tide charts on bone. They carried truth differently, not in data, but in story. When the sea took their lands, they did not map it. They sang it. They made gods of its power, spirits of its sorrow. They passed the memory not to record it, but to survive it. Across the Pacific, islanders speak of vanished homelands, lands that once lay where there is now only open sea. In Australia, indigenous oral histories describe coastal features that were submerged thousands of years ago, yet described with uncanny geological precision. In northwest Europe, the legend of Lyonesse tells of a sunken kingdom beneath the waves west of Cornwall, echoing the fate of Doggerland, a once thriving plain that linked Britain to the continent before it was swallowed by the North Sea. These stories span time not because they are exact, but because they are true in the way that matters most. They kept people aware. They taught future generations where not to build, what signs to heed, what consequences follow imbalance. The water was not just physical. It was moral. It rose because the world had been wronged, by hubris, by greed, by a broken covenant with the sacred. The flood, then, becomes more than memory. It becomes a lesson. And in the Holocene's delicate calm, after the Younger Dryas had passed after the ice had receded, the waters crept with deceptive kindness. Over millennia, shorelines shifted by hundreds of kilometres. In the Americas, the Beringian land bridge, once a vast corridor, was swallowed, isolating populations. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf vanished beneath the sea, fragmenting what was once a single great landmass into thousands of islands. Every continent bears the marks: sunken forests, drowned river mouths, ancient tools beneath the ocean floor. And so we told stories, because the sea does not leave maps. The universality of flood myths hints at a deeper architecture in the human mind, a need to explain catastrophe, to anchor it in meaning. A memory of a time when the world was lost and remade. Not all peoples would have experienced the rising tides as a singular event, but across generations they witnessed their world unravel. Hills became islands, estuaries turned to gulfs, sacred sites slipped beneath the horizon, and still life went on. The myth was not the end of the world, it was the bridge to the next one. In this way, storytelling was survival, not just of information, but of identity. Each retelling, each ritual, kept the knowledge alive, that the earth could change, that it had changed before, and that wisdom lay in remembering not only how, but why. Myths were not warnings of the past, they were instructions for the future. And perhaps that is why they endured with such tenacity, not just through generations, but across entire continents and languages, echoing with a kind of sacred resonance. The story of the flood is not just one tale, it is 1,000, spoken in different tongues but rooted in a shared experience of loss, survival, and transformation. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim and a divine deluge. In India, Manu is warned by a talking fish. In the Andes, water rises to punish the hubris of giants. In North America, the Cree speak of a great canoe and an endless rain. These are not carbon copies. They are adaptations, moulded by culture, belief, and the specific contours of geography, but at their core lies the same elemental drama: water, rising beyond control, the land drowned, the people humbled and changed. And always someone survives. The survivor, often chosen, sometimes flawed, sometimes divine, becomes the seed for a new world. This figure, whether Utnapishtim or Noah or Deucalion, represents something ancient in our cognition. The idea that knowledge must pass through fire or flood to be purified and reborn. That memory, to matter, must be carried. Not everything is saved, but something is, and that is enough. In this way, oral tradition becomes a vessel, not only for information but for transformation. The stories are not static. They breathe, bend, and evolve as the people who hold them do. They absorb new meanings, adapt to new dangers. When seas rise, we tell of gods who weep. When famine comes, we speak of betrayal and forbidden fruit. Myth becomes the language by which we negotiate chaos, a map of meanings when the physical maps fail. Even the act of telling becomes a kind of ritualized resilience. Around the fire, in the hush between night sounds, the old ones speak and the children listen. And though the words may change, the shape of the tale remains. A reminder that the world once changed everything, and could again. But perhaps the most astonishing truth is that these stories may not be merely metaphorical. Modern science is beginning to catch up with myth. Bathymetric mapping reveals sunken shorelines, where oral tradition says there were once forests. Genetic studies show human migrations timed with environmental collapse. Archaeological findings beneath the waves, tools, hearths, bones, suggest that human habitation once lay far beyond today's coasts. The stories may be old, but they are not imaginary. They are the residue of real events, shaped by imagination, filtered through memory, and passed like torches across the millennia. Myth is not the opposite of fact. It is what remains when the facts are gone, but the truth still matters. And in this way, the flood survives, not just in stone tablets or ancient scrolls, but in the marrow of our language and the longing in our stories. That longing is more than nostalgia. It is orientation, a compass that points not to a location, but to a state of understanding. Through myth, we locate ourselves in the vast sweep of time, finding a place not just on the land, but in the legacy of those who endured before us. The flood stories serve as temporal anchors. They are reminders that humanity has faced ruin and renewal not once, but many times, and that each renewal came with a cost. Flood myths often contain a strange tension between mercy and consequence. The divine or supernatural force does not always destroy out of cruelty. More often, the deluge is cast as a cleansing, a chance to begin again. Yet what is washed away is never fully retrieved. A language, a way of life, a lineage of names that will never be spoken again. The survivors do not carry everything, only enough. In the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians, there are flood narratives that span over 10,000 years, recalling landscapes that now lie submerged off the continent's coastlines. These are not mythic in the modern sense of fabrication. They are memories stretched across generations, polished by repetition, and refined by cultural reverence. Their survival suggests that when memory is held collectively, with care and meaning, it can rival even the written word. And still, we often misunderstand myth. We strip it of its emotional fidelity, dissecting it for data while forgetting its rhythm. We seek the literal at the expense of the experiential. But to the people who carried these stories, truth was never a narrow path. It was a woven thing, made of fact and feeling, of terror and teaching. A flood, in this view, is not just a geological event. It is an emotional ecosystem. It is the chaos of the sky mirrored in the soul. Across the Pacific, Polynesian traditions speak of islands swallowed by the sea. In Dogon cosmology, water is both a life-bringer and a devourer. In Japan, tsunamis were once believed to be the anger of drowned ancestors. What ties these visions together is not uniformity, but the pattern of recognition. The earth speaks, and humans remember. This capacity, to hear the warning in the wave, the teaching in the tempest, is part of what made us survivors. The stories we told were not diversions from reality. They were tools for engaging with it. They encoded behavioural lessons, where not to build, what to notice in the sky, how to read the rising winds. In this sense, myth was never a retreat from danger, but a rehearsal for it. And now, as waters rise again in our own time, these ancient rehearsals come back into focus. The flood is no longer just behind us. It is once more approaching the edge of the firelight, and perhaps that is why these stories have lingered. Not because they told us what was, but because they keep telling us what could be. The myths were never simply about water. They were about forgetting, about the consequences of arrogance or disconnection or neglect. In the flood, the earth does not punish, it resets. It reminds us of the scale on which it moves and how fragile our foothold truly is. This is what the ancient storytellers knew, that survival was never just about food or shelter. It was about memory, about holding on to the meanings that mattered when the sky fell and the rivers surged. In a sense, myths were the original climate models, not in charts and equations, but in metaphor and melody. They translated terror into instruction, awe into continuity. In the melting shadows of the Younger Dryas, as glaciers withdrew and coastlines redrew themselves, entire worlds vanished beneath the waves. But the people who had watched the ice crack and the waters rise had learned to carry more than tools. They carried stories, not just of what happened, but how to live with what happened. And these stories became seeds. From them grew rituals, songs, navigational knowledge, seasonal calendars, place names embedded in oral topographies that mapped a disappearing world with astonishing precision. Myths, in this way, were not about escapism. They were the operating system of survival. And if we listen closely, we can hear the same instincts today. In every community grappling with rising seas and shifting skies, stories are still being told. Stories of resilience, of mourning, of adaptation. They're not carved in stone or painted on cave walls, but they echo the same heartbeat. The need to remember, the need to warn. The need to belong to something larger than a single lifetime. That is the quiet truth hidden inside the flood myth. Not destruction, but continuity. Not despair, but the stubborn human refusal to let go of meaning. We told these stories to mark what was lost, yes, but also to ensure something would remain. Something to light the path back should we ever be washed away again. So the flood lives on, in Sumerian tablets, in Andean chants, in the dreams of Pacific navigators. It lives in lullabies sung to children by parents who do not know they are echoing a 10,000-year-old warning. It lives in the way we watch the sea now, uncertain, unsettled, remembering something we never consciously learned. And in the end, perhaps that is our deepest inheritance. Not the tools, not the bones, not even the language. But the stories we keep telling each other when the water rises, when the sky breaks, when the earth asks us once again to remember who we are and what we've already survived. We were nearly lost, but we were not. In the quiet between glacial breaths, we learned not just how to survive, but how to remember, to hope, and to imagine futures. There is a silence that falls after the storm, deeper than the quiet before it. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of certainty. And it was in that silence, in the millennia that followed the cold, that something within us remained. Not strong, not loud, just unbroken. What is it that threads one generation to the next when nothing else remains? Not monuments, not maps, not even names. Only the breath of memory passed from mouth to mouth. We speak of human continuity as though it were inevitable, as though the line from then to now is a straight one. But it is not. It is a thread frayed by cold, thinned by famine, nearly severed by silence. Still, it held. The Holocene, gentle by comparison, was not a gift. It was a window, and even then, only barely ajar. What survived the long winter was not just a species, but a capacity to imagine each other, to share across time and pain, to pass down not just instructions, but meaning. It is easy to think of survival in terms of shelters and fires, but what about lullabies? What about the way a parent's face softens when telling a child who they are? From mother to daughter, from elder to child, from hunter to listener, from ancestor to unborn, the thread was always memory. Memory not of individual lives, but of being human. That strange luminous feeling that says, I am here and I see you. It is the memory that cries when a stranger dies, that grieves for the fallen mammoth, not just as food, but as presence, that looks at the stars and asks, Who else? How do you explain a human to the future? What measures us, if not stone or spear? It is not the tools themselves, but the hands that shaped them. Not the fires, but the stories told beside them. The fact that even when the world collapsed around us, we still painted, still carved, still sang, as if defiance was written into our marrow, as if meaning itself was a form of resistance. Across the expanse of ice and time, we did more than endure. We watched the winds change and the forests move, and still we stayed. Not in place, but in self. We crossed oceans and outlived giants. We merged with cousins and mourned their vanishings. Yet through all of it, some quiet part of our consciousness held steady, like a heartbeat beneath the noise. What is that pulse? What name do you give the thing that survives even when all else does not? What do you call the thread that did not break? You call it wonder. You call it longing. You call it human. And though it cannot be held or buried or dated in sediment, it is perhaps the most enduring artifact we possess. The persistent, fragile pulse of mind across deep time. This thread, invisible to the archaeologist's trowel but unmistakable in the quiet of a shared glance, has never ceased to move through us. Some call it culture, some call it soul, but regardless of name, it is the thing that held on when bodies failed, when campsites emptied, when entire populations vanished into fog and myth. It is what turned hunger into ritual, fear into prayer, and pain into song. It is not just that we made tools or built shelters. Other creatures build, other minds remember. But only we shaped remembrance into myth, and then passed that myth into the trembling hands of the next. Consider what it means to survive, not just biologically, but emotionally. Imagine standing in a high glacial valley, your kin long dead, the cold indifferent and still, telling the child beside you a story of the sky. Not because it will warm you, not because it will feed you, but because it gives shape to the ache of being alive. Because it tells the child that this moment, this silence, this struggle, it has happened before, and that it passed. That is the thread. This is not sentimentality, it is science. The continuity of consciousness can be traced in the way language evolved, in the rhythm of oral traditions, in the carved ochre that reappears across sites continents apart. We did not simply replicate behaviours, we remembered meanings, and those meanings changed us. The mythic brain is not a distraction from survival. It was, and remains, one of its most powerful engines. Empathy is not ornamental, it is structural. To imagine another's mind, even one long gone, even one yet to be, is the root of alliance, of learning, of everything civilization would one day become. The brain that weeps beside a grave is the same brain that will one day build temples, and the one that dreams beside a fire is the one that will someday send signals into space, hoping not to be alone. That is what nearly died in the cold. Not just flesh, not just names, but this long echo of thought folding into thought, the slow, stubborn climb towards something called future. And yet it remained. Not easily, not completely, but enough. Enough to begin again. Enough to tell this story. Enough perhaps to understand why it matters that we can still tell it at all. For what is culture, if not the memory of survival passed forward through time? Every gesture we inherit, the patterns of kinship, the carving of bone, the cadence of lullabies, is a kind of fossil, not of body, but of choice. These are the imprints left by minds that once trembled in the dark, whispering to themselves, stay. Remember. Hope. From the edge of extinction emerged not only the ability to adapt, but the courage to envision continuity. In archaeological sites across the globe, we find symbols that repeat. Spirals, handprints, animals, stars. These were not mere decorations. They were acts of transmission. Signs left in stone and pigment to say, I was here. You're not alone. This matters. It matters because this thread of meaning weaves across landscapes and lifetimes. When a mother tells a story by firelight that her grandmother once told her, she becomes a bridge across 10,000 forgotten moments. When a burial site includes pigments, beads, and tools, we see not just mourning, but meaning, a message across the threshold of death. This life had value. And when entire populations vanished, their stories did not always vanish with them. Genetic memory, cultural echoes, linguistic residues, These are the ghost notes of vanished songs, still humming beneath the chorus of the present. The people of today are not only descendants of survivors, we are descendants of the storytellers, of the ones who refuse to let silence be the end. It is in this refusal that resilience becomes sacred. Imagine walking through a cave and placing your hand on the outline of another, painted in ochre 20,000 years ago. It is not a message exactly. It is not even language. And yet, it is everything. Presence. Continuity. A thread stretched across time from one trembling hand to another. You cannot know their name, their face, their fate. But for a moment, you know their existence. And you know you are meant to. That is the kind of survival no fossil can measure. In this way, culture is not a luxury of peace. It is forged in hardship, in scarcity, in the long winters of the soul. And each time it is passed on, in word, in gesture, in myth, it becomes stronger. It learns how to bend without breaking, how to carry more than fact, how to carry meaning. And meaning, we are beginning to understand, is its own kind of adaptation. Because even as climates shifted and species vanished and the earth itself shuddered in upheaval, this fragile inheritance continued. The need to say something, to someone, about the wonder and the ache of being alive. Because even as climates shifted and species vanished and the earth itself shuddered in upheaval, this fragile inheritance continued. The need to say something, to someone, about the wonder and the ache of being alive. This was not merely survival of the body, it was survival of the self, of the shared self, the one that extends beyond the boundary of flesh, that lives in the gaze of another, in the memory of ancestors, in the dream of unborn kin. Such continuity is delicate, not guaranteed. We know this too well. For every group that endured, there were others who did not. Whole lineages blinked out in the snow, their last thoughts unspoken, their last myths untold, and yet, somehow the thread held, not because we were strongest, but perhaps because we were most connected, to each other, to place, to story. As the Holocene offered its warmth, as rivers softened their frozen silence and valleys filled with green, we did not merely return to the world, we reimagined it. We built gathering places, not just shelters. We shaped landscapes with intention, not just desperation. Where once we scattered for safety, we now assembled for meaning. Rituals rose like dawnlight, slow, soft, certain. Burials became more elaborate, adorned not only with the necessities of life, but with symbols of belief. Red ochre, shaped beads, carved figurines. These were the signs of inner lives that no ice could freeze. They marked a shift, from survival to remembrance, from instinct to wisdom. And in this, empathy bloomed. Having nearly been extinguished, we began to look at one another not only as competitors for resources, but as companions in fragility. The scars of near extinction etched a kind of knowing into our shared being, a recognition that we are not separate from one another, nor from the wider world, but interwoven with it. You can see this deepened bond in the care extended to the elderly, the injured, and the dead. In species that live on the edge, weakness is often a sentence, but in us, it became something else, an invitation to connection. A reminder that worth is not measured in utility but in presence, in memory, in story. And the stories grew. Some were practical, how to track game, how to prepare seeds, how to read the weather in the sky's breath. Others were grand, tales of creation, of ancestors who danced with stars, of floods that remade the world. These myths were not lies. They were truths wrapped in metaphor, designed not to inform but to transform. They were the mechanisms by which meaning became portable. You could carry a myth farther than you could carry food. You could pass it through generations without fire, without tools, without maps. Just breath, just voice, just the enduring need to remember. And through these myths, a quiet strength unfurled, not loud, not triumphant, but steady. The kind that does not shout its existence, but proves it simply by still being here. This strength is not measured in conquest or in monuments. It is measured in lullabies whispered beside sleeping children, in footprints that fade with the wind but are followed still, in hands reaching out not to take, but to offer. The thread, that invisible line connecting the first breath to this one, is not made of stone or fire or steel. It is made of attention, of care, of memory kept alive through love. Even now we carry it. We, who walk beneath electric skies and speak to satellites and breathe air changed by our own hands. We are not removed from those who once crouched by firelight, painting antelope on limestone walls. We are them, their blood in our veins, their fears in our bones, their dreams still echoing in the quiet of our minds when all other noise falls away. The thread continues not just because it is unbroken, but because we choose, again and again, to pick it up. In times of ease, it may seem like ornament, a relic of simpler times. But when the world trembles, when certainties crumble and maps blur, it is the thread we turn to. It is story that steadies us, memory that roots us, hope that draws us forward. For in that near loss, when we dwindled to fewer than a whisper, we did not just survive, we learned the cost of forgetting, and in that learning we chose differently. We began to teach not only how to live, but why. And now, as we look back, across the long mirror of deep time, we are reminded there were others, other kinds of humans, other possible worlds. Some left no trace, some live in our DNA. All are part of the same great unfolding. We are not the conclusion of that story. We are its continuation. To know this is not to feel pride, it is to feel responsibility, because the thread can break. Still. Now. Climate shifts again, biodiversity wanes, old tensions re-emerge in new disguises, and yet, here we are, remembering, listening, wondering. This story of survival, of beauty found in bleakness, of meaning born under pressure, is not just history. It is instruction. It is compass. It tells us that we come from a lineage that nearly vanished, and that what saved us was not power but connection, not dominance but empathy, not numbers but care. So tonight, if you feel small or afraid or uncertain, remember this. You're the result of an unbroken line of wonder. You're a thread that did not break. Hold it. Tend it. Pass it on. The Ice Age nearly erased us, but it also revealed what we are made of, and what we still might become. Thank you, fellow Sapiens, for walking this long arc of memory and fire with me, topic journey, that carried us from extinction's edge to the whisper of futures still forming. If this story helped you feel a little more wonder, a little more connection, or even just a moment of stillness in a restless world, then your presence here has meant everything. Perhaps one moment lingers in your thoughts now, a buried footprint, a painted handprint, a single firelight flicker between the glacial dark and dawn. I wonder what thread found you, and what part of it you'll carry forward. Whether it was the shape of a story buried in a flood, the hush of stars reflected in retreating ice, or the ache of a voice that survived inside your bones. These fragments, fragile and echoing, are what remind us we were never alone in the telling. If you feel called to share what stayed with you, I invite you to leave it in the comments, not as noise, but as a quiet offering. A gesture in the ongoing circle of remembrance, a way to build this thoughtful corner of the world together. If you'd like to walk with us again, you can subscribe or share this story with someone who walks wide roads with a quiet mind. There are more stories coming, of silence, of survival, of stars still waiting to be named. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,